Okay. Got it. Okay, hello, and hello everyone. So this will be a presentation, one-part presentation on neither vertical nor horizontal, a theory of political organization by Rodrigo Nunes. So yeah, I want to set up like a few of the things about the pace of the presentation and some of the choices I've made, because I'm doing a presentation in a book, right? So I had to make quite a lot of choices. And I try to make my choices in a way that I can include as much things as possible, even if I cannot really go that deep into the debates in which they emerge. So I'm trying to really like refine the concepts that are the most useful, and then perhaps I think that the next step for like when you do a presentation like that is to actually go to where these concepts come from, so to the like theoretical discussion around them, and then to actually explore them further. So I am prioritizing to actually give like a fuller picture of how the concepts are deployed in the book, rather than going through like each of the debates, how each of the debates work, because there is a lot of debate. Like just in this book at the beginning, like I think each chapter has at least like one big theoretical debate from the left. Like you have the debate from Jodi and Wendy Brown through like Walter Benjamin or whatever, and then you have like the debate of Mio Porcaro. You have all the things about like the Italian operaista tradition. So there is a lot there, which I cannot possibly like substantiate everything. So I'm going to be focusing on the concepts and how they actually how they animate the book. And yeah, so yeah, this is what I wanted to call a well-intentioned and modest introduction. So yeah, this is pretty much what I want, what the vibe that I want to send through with it. And it's also an invitation to anyone who would like to work in the intersection between our framework and Rodrigo's. I think that what is most valuable about reading this book with this group in particular is the fact that a lot of the questions which we have been formulating at our own terms appear here also in Rodrigo's own terms. And there are a lot of common, like intuitive ways in which they fit. So I hope that by presenting the concepts that are used by Rodrigo, we can see ourselves in Rodrigo's book, see Rodrigo's effort like in our own, and perhaps find like what is not contemplated by any of them, perhaps, and like emerge, make something else emerge over there. So yeah, I'm going focusing on the trajectory, the concepts we utilize, and like what are the stakes in some of these deployments in particular. And let me just, because it always do that. So let me just do something. Okay, yeah, that's good. Now I can see things properly. Now I can. Yeah, so if we start by asking, this is a quote right in the beginning of the book. So if we start by asking what organization is, the first answer we will find is that it comes in various forms and variable degrees. That means in turn that we must also be capable of taking into account the relations that organizations establish among themselves, those that unaffiliated individuals establish with one another and with organizations, and the system that all these relations constitute together. In other words, we cannot think organization in isolation from one another until we have first conceived the organization as pertaining to the entire ecology to which they belong. This shifts the conversation from what form should our organizations have, or what kind of organization should subsume the whole ecology, to questions such as how can different organizations complete each other. This is interesting already because it sets something that I think it's a common underlying trend in the book, is that the book actually tries to use forms that are extremely current in that have a lot of currency in political discourse. So for example, ecology right now, and it tries to actually wrap these around the question of organization. So you guys are going to see that a lot with the question of platforms and like a lot of the other concepts that will appear. So for Rodrigo, organizations opens that capacity to the risk of its appropriation by particular interest. And this is, he makes this distinction between potentia and potestas, in which they respectively mean potentia would be the power to do things, and potestas would be the power over others. So it's like he's working within this distinction, and organization is what enables both of these in a way. So it's a sort of a pharmacon, which is the metaphor that he's using, drawing from Derrida and from, yeah, pretty much everywhere. And it's not passing. Yeah, another metaphor that he puts is the metaphor of the nebula, or like how organizations actually constitute these very dispersed, phenomena. So for Rodrigo, the on the ground in itself reality that corresponded to the idea of a globe spanning for itself, the conscious, organized world proletariat, always looked quite different depending on where you looked. Movements are always nebulae or networks. It is only the degree to which they are centralized that varies. So it's interesting, like here already, like right in the beginning of the book, you already get two extremely contemporary forms, which are the network and the ecology. So they are already like the forms that Rodrigo takes as his prime, like as his like material to actually work on a theory of organization. So the central issues that the book wants to address. So it's first, on the one hand, the excessive confidence regarding self-organization as the only horizon, considering complexity as a threshold of impossibility. So the fact that like the reliance or the belief that the world is so complex, thus it cannot be organized. Therefore, if organization is an impossible task, we have to talk about emergence. We have to talk about complexity as this enabling condition to which things emerge. So anyway, like it's a sort of capitulation of that question. And on the other hand, you have how the organizational question is always filtered through how certain ideal forms have to be what fixes this impossibility of organization or this complexity. So complexity appears as a problem in both of these. Like it's interesting that complexity appears not as a fact, but as a problem to be solved. The first one by its own existence. So complexity resolves itself by emergence. And then in the other one, complexity resolves itself by imposing some ideal form that will actually organize it and make its complexity bearable for us. So how the organizational question is always filtered through ideal forms. So the party form, the union, horizontalism, verticalism, these are all like the terms in which the book deals with. So yeah, this is a beautiful monument of young Mao, which is it's something that Rodrigo quotes also. So for the purposes of this book, the Maoist idea, of course, that the masses make history indicates neither a general explanatory scheme nor an underlying subject of history, but something more ordinary and almost tautological. It simply points out that in order to overcome the resistance of the powers that be, any major historical transformation will always require the confluence of a large number of individuals, a collective subject or agent, in other words. It already becomes quite interesting here when we look at how Rodrigo is working, because if you look at it, he doesn't want to do away with a collective subject as a revolution. Not perhaps he wants to do away sort of with the idea of revolution, but he doesn't want to do away with the idea of a collective subject that can exist contingently in a specific particular framework. And this will become clearer throughout the book, like in the challenges that he makes to some of the concepts. And so for Rodrigo, if the idea that it would be possible to do away with the question of organization arises from a misunderstanding of its double nature as pharmacon, poison and remedy, danger and enabling condition, whatever, the idea that it could be solved once and for all has a different mistake at its origin. So if you see, it's already like mapped into the 2 points that I was mentioning. So the first point would be like complexity as something that solves itself, and like the organization being solved merely by the emergence of new things. The second one would be the idea that like you have to find the ideal form that can organize that mass. And that mistake is the supposition that the question concerns the search for an ideal organizational form that should be universally replicated or subsume all others. And one of the things that I want to call attention to also, like it's particularly at the beginning of the book, is that Rodrigo's making he's making a sort of a plea for a different kind of political realism. And for Rodrigo, these truly realist political arguments can only follow the mission of political realism by being loyal to what he calls the historical political conjuncture. I was fascinated by like how the conjuncture is advocated in the book, because it appears only like in a few moments, but it's actually, you see that thinking in the conjuncture is an important thing. And I had a chance to ask this to Rodrigo, like in an interview that he did with like in the News Center for like one of our public programs. And yeah, there is an influence of Althusser's reading of Machiavelli over there, which goes heavily in the concept of the conjuncture and everything. And but yeah, the idea of thinking the conjuncture and this is, I think, where Rodrigo gets really close to what Althusser and what Althusser is doing with Machiavelli, and what Machiavelli is doing in his own lane in that way, is that as long as one does not remain stuck within ideal forms, but actually look at what can be attainable under a particular circumstance. Which means that Rodrigo is concerned with the relationship between political experimentation in a way, sure, but also the way it is conditioned with the conjuncture that dictates what is politically possible and viable as a constraint and as an enabling mechanism. So both of these things are like where the book plays also, which maps into really nicely into the concept of organization itself as a pharmacon and so on and so forth. So yeah, the main big question that the book starts by asking is what kind of field is the left? And here in particular, let me just turn my lights on because I think I am just like disappearing. Just one sec. And here I am. So yeah, what kind of field is the left? This is a question that he asks. It's interesting that the screen that he uses to sort of like project this question is the debate between Jodi Dean and Wendy Brown. And I don't know if you guys have seen that debate. Like I haven't put like a single slide about it because we would be here for ages. There's a lot of things, and Rodrigo does a very good job in doing a careful reading of both. But mainly what this debate was about, and there is something in particular that like a symmetry between their positions, which is the fact that like Wendy Brown is blaming a left that is obsessed with central command, with unity, and the left that does not sort of catch up with the current times in which struggles are being fought. And Jodi Dean is doing the same thing, but she's blaming actually the lack of passion of that new left, which sort of disregards the old one, and then that new left that actually has lost its desire for communism. So this is pretty much where they are. So we have, it's interesting that the format of that field, which Rodrigo talks about, is that first this whole debate serves as a sort of a symptom of the way that the left is structured as a field, and second that this symptom has a particular form, which for Rodrigo is what following Gregory Bateson is what he calls symmetrical schismogenesis, which is when members of two groups react to each other with an identical pattern of behavior with equal intensity but in opposite directions. So each group will drive the other into excessive emphasis on the pattern, a process which, if not restrained, can only lead to more and more extreme rivalry and ultimately to hostility and the breakdown of the system. So we are talking we're talking about two groups within a place, but also Rodrigo says that makes the case for talking about perspectives rather than groups, being the point not so much the fact that these fields are actually separated, but there are a number of characteristics that see themselves as inherited from these fields. So the left, the 1917 base left, and the 1968 sort of like bad leftist or something, or the opposite way around, which you see 1917 left as that which is actually like old and cranky and doesn't really know what to do or whatever, and then the 1968 as that which is yours, that we identify with as like the attempt to try something new and to like be really flexible or whatever. And yeah, so these two perspectives rather than groups, they do not say something about like the problem being in one or the other of them, but they actually say something about the dynamic of the field itself, which is this escalation of patterns of behavior in different directions that actually like have the same intensity as they confront each other, because one can only exist when the other is actually taken as the counterfeit, the counterpart of the conflict. And so basically the main format of that would be something like, if only the fake left, whatever you say, got out of the way, the real one could actually work something. So if only these fucking autonomists would stop doing what they are doing, then us, the real communists, could actually accomplish something. If only these flower power anarchists would actually stop doing what they are doing, then finally we could get something out of that. But yeah, in this sense, organization takes us out of the circuitries of drive, according to Rodrigo at least, and takes us back into a fundamental question. So for Rodrigo, like this dynamic of actually trying to blame everything that you have, like every lack of lack of your own success within a field into the other side, is something that is attached to a certain drive, which is something that feeds off into the lack of a discussion of organization. So the lack of discussions on political organization is a symptom of that dynamic to Rodrigo. And for Rodrigo, the main question that organization brings into the conjuncture in that sense and into like the present moment is, what is it that we really desire? And for Rodrigo, this is the main objective for Rodrigo to actually like talk about these things. I think in the actual argument, of course, it's much more refined. Like he has an extensive discussion of Jodi Dean's text, for example, which is really helpful. Like you can see him there, because Jodi Dean herself has her own 2 cents in the question of desire, right? Like she's talking about the retrieval of communist desire, and she writes the book about it and everything. But it is still very interesting that Rodrigo can see these 2 oppositions as like a symmetrical opposition that says something that can actually like perform a diagnosis of the left as a field. And yeah, so talking about that field in particular, Rodrigo uses these metaphors a lot. So the field, the gradient, and the ideal forms that structure each side of the field. So what we see here is that actually like this opposition that was crystallized in the figures of Wendy Brown and Jodi Dean is actually like illustrates pretty well what he calls this struggle between what would be a horizontalist left and a verticalist left in a way. So on the one hand, while the horizontal left has an emphasis on figures such as direct social action, autonomy, plurality, and bottom-up organization, the vertical left would be emphasizing on other aspects of politics itself. So emphasis on the state apparatus, unity, leadership, and hegemony. There's also something important that appears in the end of the book about the diagram, because Rodrigo makes a very, I think it's either at the last chapter or like it's very en passant in a way, but it's very interesting that he talks about also the 2 different visions of sovereignty that each of these have. So in the one hand, when sovereignty is like something that is always collective to like and connected to the people, in the other hand, like sovereignty is something that is taken as a feature of the state apparatus and the capacity of decision that actually like the state apparatus can have. So you have also these 2 figures of sovereignty that could be included in that diagram in a way. And for Rodrigo, what happens in this is that what we have is a circular causality. If these terms can appear as mutually exclusive, so as a choice, it is because what should mediate between them has disappeared. As a mediating element, organization cannot but disappear, given what it is supposed to mediate, presents itself as unmediatable. That disappearance, it should be noted, is at once theoretical and practical, and the relationship between those 2 aspects is also mutually reinforcing. So excessive abstraction inhibits practice. The absence of practice stimulates abstraction. So it's a sort of like another feedback, positive feedback that Rodrigo is describing. Yet it is precisely because of this circularity that organization might go from lost object to transitional object and thus become the means for recovering itself. To think organization concretely is to think in terms of specific problems rather than merely conceptual relations. And this is going to be important for like another diagram that we see. But it's interesting here that like Rodrigo is making this step for, it's one of the first times in the book that Rodrigo makes the step of like how, what does it mean to say that organization is an idea of mediation? And first, mediation is something that disappears itself in the process of transforming that conceptual opposition into something real. And second, organization is this sort of unfinishable task, which appears itself time and time again, depending on a certain conjuncture. And it does not appear itself only through the through conceptual means, but it actually appears like through, it actually appears in practice as such. And its conceptuality is just like a consequence of its like very practical demands. And yeah, form, force, and mediation for Nunes. This is one of the main things that he wants to bet on. Like we had a big discussion about this in CPC. I think it's a very interesting point that that Rodrigo makes itself. There are some erasers over there, which I would love you guys to discuss. But mainly what he's talking about is like 2 pictures of what organization would be. So on the one hand, we would have Lukács's picture, which is, so for Lukács, organization is what appears in between a conceptual opposition between theory and practice and praxis. So like you have of course the play of identity and non-identity over there, and then organization is the form of mediation between theory and practices. So between, but organization here is a mediation between two conceptual opposites. So it's an endeavor which in practice one builds a form that may overcome a conceptual position, even if this conceptual position is formulated through a concrete articulation. And on the other hand, he puts that like, he opposes that to, and he makes this very weird triad of like Kant, Simondon, and Plato as like the actual bearers of real opposition. So as the actual names and thought thinkers that real opposition appears as a possibility. So the real opposition, instead of being attached to the concepts of to what is conceptualized as theory or praxis, it is actually a mediation of an opposition that is already real between two forces. So a force A and a force B. And the organization is not the task of finding a form of mediation, but actually the act of mediating as such between these forces. So for that matter, wait, oh fuck, what did I do? In a minute. Okay. Yeah. Organization is framed as a question of recognition that the stability of these objects should be organized is itself temporary. And the example that he has here, of course, it's one of these crucial moments in the book that Machiavelli appears. And it is not for nothing that Machiavelli appears. There is also like, there is a very interesting, the interesting thing about the like Machiavelli has a similar opposition for that, right? Like when he's opposing virtue, which is the like the personal capacity of a certain agent to actually enjoy a situation, and the favorability of the situation as such, which is fortuna. We are talking about like a real opposition between these two forces also. So it is not like a stupid mention over there, but it is actually like entirely attached to what Rodrigo is actually trying to do in talking about like the mediation between the forces. Because in Machiavelli, you can see a figure in which these two things encounter themselves in a particular conjuncture. So you have these as a sort of like the main framework through which a real opposition between forces can be visible to the theorist in general. So for Rodrigo, and I'm quoting him here, whereas logical opposition demands a logical solution, the construction of a third term as the synthesis in which the first two are somehow made compatible, what he presents to us is something else. So mediation is not a problem that can be solved, not even in principle, once and for all. If forms are but the temporary, more or less fragile stability of the relations that compose them, the balance between forces is the more fundamental problem. And since that balance changes over time under the action of internal tendencies as well as outside factors, the object of mediation ought to be the forces themselves, not form. So yeah, this is pretty much where he states what that is about. There is, of course, I forgot to mention that, but the main thing about like that we were discussing in CPC about in these two oppositions is that like he's talking about the problem of measure, of course, in that particular chapter, but there is no mention of Hegel at all. So for those of you who are Hegelian savvy, you can enjoy that moment to actually like try to actually wrap this question around in like Hegelian terms, perhaps, because there is a very I would say a deliberate, and this is something that like it says something about the vibe of the book in general. Like the book is a very it's a very conciliatory attempt in which like you have multiple nods to different like to the different lefts itself. So it's a book that is like that theory about the fields is made like you're made extremely aware about it through the book, because you see the book nodding to both like the vertical and the horizontal at the same time. So like the book is trying to make that mediation also in the theoretical choices that it makes. And yeah, you guys can see that very clearly, I think, like through some of the choices and like the theoretical quotes that you actually put, and also the authors and like how the genealogies are made and how everything is discussed. It's really a part of the selection of everything. So yeah, that's good. Initial questions. So this is our like with this we are already like in much further chapters. Mainly some of the questions that appear like for Rodrigo beyond the book is also with the question of revolution. And the question of revolution is tackled by Rodrigo in three main ways. So first, the concepts, like the way that the concept of revolution is itself embedded with the sins of teleology, determinism, and like an imputation of necessity into either history or nature. and upon the arrival of communism. The second is the issue of what he calls the issue of transitivity. The issue for transitivity from him is how social objectivity can be translated into political subjectivity. So he's interested in like how that relationship is made politically, and in trying to make that relationship neither like an impossible one, but also not one that is automatic, in which like you occupy a certain subjective position within a social objectivity, therefore you are part or not part of the revolutionary subject as such. And the third one is the way in which ideas of revolution and change and social order might be guilty of hylomorphism, which is here, of course, he's doing a nod to Simondon's critique of Aristotle, of the idea of hylomorphism in Aristotle. So we're gonna be able to see what he means exactly by that. But there is also a certain critique of the, like particularly of really existing socialism in the gist of what Rodrigo is doing over here. So yeah, first, contingency or necessity. So the main questions that animate this part of the chapter is the fact that like how are we to judge the inevitability of revolution, and like the metaphors that usually appear to be able to actually do that. So the court of history, the train of history, and like all these metaphors that appear as sort of like either ways to wait for redemption and to really have revolution as this sort of like a theological concept that can be like a final salvation in the doom world, or also as something that is already embedded within history, so as a linear trajectory that can take you there. This is pretty much what he's criticizing. There's a fascinating bit on Marxism and liberalism within modernity and the relationship between both of them, which, it's very well argued over there. And the third thing is about the question of historical consciousness and humanity, and like the possibility that like historical consciousness itself is not something, it's not really like a necessary feature, but actually something that is contingently acquired in particular circumstances and in particular conjunctures. And in terms of transitivity and composition, he's talking about like the revolutionary subject. And there is a very interesting engagement with the question of standpoint theory. And I put this quote over here because it's, first of all, it's one of my favorite titles in an essay that like, I really love that title. I think it like just hits every spot. It's an essay from Mark Fisher called No Romance Without Finance. And there is an interesting bit about how this is actually like mobilized over there. So what Fisher says, and I think it fits really well with what Rodrigo was saying, that's why I put it over there. To have one's consciousness raised is not merely to become aware of facts of which one was previously ignorant. It is instead to have one's whole relationship to the world shifted. So the relationship, as you can see, like the relationship between subjectivity, like political subjectivity, and social objectivity is itself shifted as a whole, and not merely like there is not a direct transitivity between both of them. Rather, consciousness raising is productive. It creates a new subject. A we that is both the agent of struggle and what is struggled for. At the same time, consciousness raising intervenes in the object of the world itself, but is now no longer apprehended at some static opacity, the nature of which is already decided, but it's something that can be transformed. This transformation requires knowledge. It will not come about through spontaneity, voluntarism, the experiencing of ruptural events, or by virtue of marginality alone. Hence, Hartstock's concept of standpoint epistemology, which maintains, following Lukács and Marx, that subjugated groups potentially have an access to knowledge of the whole social field. That I think here it's more following Lukács than Marx, but anyway, I'm not going to speak you of Fisher. But yeah, the whole social field that the dominant group lacks. Members of subjugated groups do not, however, automatically possess this knowledge as of right. It can only be accessed once group consciousness is developed. According to Hartstock, the vision available to the oppressed group must be struggled for and represents an achievement which requires both science to see beyond the surface of the social relations in which all are forced to participate, and the education which can only grow from struggle to change those relations. So this is a very clear example of like the sort of questions that Rodrigo is asking about. And this is also like, it's sort of a bad feature of the book, not a bad feature, but like it's something that makes the book hard to present, because the book is like, it's a sequential book, but like the concepts themselves, they appear a lot of times already hinted. So like you have ecology there, and then you have like a chapter about ecology like ages later when you think you know already like what ecology is. So like the book has this quality in particular. So this issue of transitivity and like social objectivity, and also like everything gets blended in a way, and it's good because it means that the concepts like interact between themselves, but it's very difficult to build a sort of a heuristics when presenting. And the question of hylomorphism to complexity. So the main practical example that he has is really existing socialism, and he talks about Stalin and particularly Stalin's plan for the development of nature. Now, there's an interesting thing about Stalin's plan for the development of nature, actually, and my mustache is an entire coincidence, I should say, but and the mentions of Stalin off record too. But the main practical example that he gives being Stalin, it is interesting that in Stalin's plan of nature, you try to make nature as something like there is this attempt of selling nature as a comrade to like the population itself. So nature has to become this productive powerhouse, which is actually different from any deployment of nature that has happened before in history, but which requires actually a shit ton of science that actually has to take nature as a matter. So like before nature becoming a comrade, it has to be taken as this sort of like material thing that can be shaped and made into a comrade in the first place. So it is a really interesting way of, because it's sort of, it is an attempt of radically like putting the authority of nature itself as something that as something that disappears. This is why nature becomes a comrade, because you make like, if this is a nation of comrades, and if this is like a place in which every worker is himself a comrade, and so on and so forth, we are talking about a picture of nature which is trumped into a certain mode and made into something that is recognizable. So this would be an example of hylomorphism into, and this sort of like trampling of complexity that he's talking about. Of course, you have the metaphor of hylomorphism. The most famous one is like, you make a brick, and the fact that like we are not talking about merely like the brick taking the form of something, but there are a number of different tensions. There is like the material tension of like the thing being put into the mold, and then stretching the mold itself, and the mold wearing off, whatever. But yeah, this is pretty much the concern that he has with hylomorphism in the idea of revolution, is that first, it becomes a way of seeing one's own position in history as one in which every action could actually be 100% thought and forecasted. And second, every action doesn't ensue into something problematic, but actually like that matter in which it is worked on is just like infinitely malleable. And of course, there is a very like grounded thing for that critique, which is the fact that the state is usually what is, or mode B, if we talk about our on our own parlance, that it is actually the responsible for bringing these forms into being. So it is actually what is put in the name on behalf of coordination and everything as that which brings a new form to be born in a way. So it is both a critique of an idea of revolution, but it is also a critique of like revolutionary practices and like days after, and the way that like revolutions had been carried away as this like heroic task of fully making first and second nature comply to like what one to one's will. And the other thing is the problem of like after the revolution, which is, here he makes a very interesting, this is also something that I want you guys to talk about, and because I think it's a very interesting thread that he puts, which is the fact that one of the main critiques that he has, that he says that the question of organization can make, is to work outside of the distinction between politics with a capital P and politics with like a minuscule, I don't know how to say, a minor p, a non-capitalized p. And the reason for him to want to work with that distinction is precisely to try to take away, because for him this distinction itself is this sort of it still relies on the sort of ruptural thing that we're talking about when talking about revolution itself. So seeing like politics not merely as this field in which like you can actually like you have a position in which you can parse out capital P politics from non-capitalized politics, is itself an assumption that is very similar to the assumption of revolutionary hylomorphism that he's talking about. And this is another step of Rodrigo's political commitment to political realism, right? Because he's talking about like, there's a very interesting bit in Althusser's comment of Machiavelli, which is when he talks about like how Machiavelli is the like being this thinker of the conjuncture. He wants everything to be really outside of that conjuncture and the text to sound as weird as possible. And I think that Rodrigo has his own bit over there, because while he is in a sort of post-Althusserian conjunction, he wants the text to not use any of the grammars that were actually like set up right after that. So like he wants to talk about politics doing away with that distinction, which has been a sort of a staple, like for Rancière, from Badiou, and for Zizek in a way also. But he wants to do away with that. And the reason for that is precisely this focus on the conjuncture and on organization as that which has to work within a series of constraints that are given by a certain conjuncture. And so what we have so far, like this is, and in here we get to like the half of the book, not and the half of the presentation. I really hope so. Yeah, the half of the presentation, a little bit past half. We have a critique of Rodrigo in a number of levels. So the first, the poverty of political vocabulary. So for Rodrigo, when he's talking about revolution and how these ideas and also like political, the way that transitivity between political subjectivity and social objectivity are being done, what he diagnoses is first like a poverty of political vocabulary, which he tries to invigorate with his own the words and concepts that he takes on loan from complexity sciences and everything. And he wants to talk about like what are the three main tenets of whatever theory has to arise within such a conjuncture that we live, which he says are the concept of a tendency, which is something that comes from his own option for seeing organization as such as a task of mediating forces, the concept of composition, which comes also from the fact that he heavily deploys the concept of ecology, like for making pretty much all of the moves that he's making. And third, in the sense of complexity, the concept of like the impossibility of a choice between the two solutions for complexity that have been given by the horizontalists and by the verticalists. And there's a critique of messianism over there. And for Rodrigo, what ends up of the concept of revolution is that revolution is the practical capacity of differentiating between the local and the systemic in political action. So this would be like Rodrigo's concept of what can revolution do if it cannot be like a hylomorphism. After all the critiques that we have gone through, like revolution for Rodrigo is this practical capacity of differentiating between the local and the systemic within the context of political action. I think this is a very elegant definition if you think about it, because like if you charge that like that definition with perhaps being too content with the local, it doesn't really pin it. It's a very slippery like characterization, very smart in that sense. If you charge it with like the other sin of being something that is actually like too systemic, you cannot really do that. So it really brings him into a position of that makes sense in the economy of the book, and that can, in my opinion, arrive to very interesting like variations. And it becomes like revolution itself. What is revolutionary? And putting it as a practical capacity binds it to the question of organization in a way that is no longer possible to see it as a question of an ideal form. So it's a very smart construction what he builds until there. Like it makes sort of what he's doing inevitable within what he's building, which I think is a great quality. In fact, like it really speaks to the whole economy of the book. And the forms of organization that could appear, so the forms of building this capacity to differentiate are dictated by that thing which he calls the conjuncture, which is what we have been discussing precisely, and that it's a term that appears just a little bit, but I'm confident that it has something to do with like with Rodrigo's own, the fact that Rodrigo has read the Althusser's texts on Machiavelli, and in Machiavelli, like he's talking precisely like when reading Machiavelli, what is being talked about by Althusser, it is precisely the way that Machiavelli travels between the available forces and carves an original position for himself, and a position which makes him an unsettling writing for both of the sides, and takes and becomes both like a bearer of extreme scientificity in the case of Machiavel. So like you make a science out of government, which is this mystic thing, but also you intervene in it in a way in which like the form which you're using to intervene is so alien to the context of the thing that it displaces the whole field as such. And yeah, this is, I think the gist of the things becomes over there. So for what does define our conjuncture then for Rodrigo? And this is something that I have picked from the book, so probably there are a lot of stuff that I have actually missed. But these are things like all important things to take into account into our conjuncture as organizers that that for Rodrigo make a lot of sense. So the mediatization of social life. So yeah, here like he's talking about like technological advancements, the way in which like the network as a form becomes one of the main ways of connection between people, and also like between becomes this sort of material construct that impacts the world and has ecological impact and everything. And the fact that this mediatization becomes a drop, marks a drop in organizational costs in general. So organizing yourself and having the tools to actually organize yourself is something like that has been significantly, has its cost lowered and being like more, one could say, diffused through like the social. And the third thing is the crisis of the post-political centrism. So that instead of being in like the turn of like the 90s, we are actually in a moment in which the solution of post-political centrism becomes extremely undesirable, and there is a rampant distrust in the institutions from both the left and the right. Fourth is the decline in membership and relevance of mass political movements. Fifth, it's the Anthropocene, of course, planet, we're all gonna die. Just the normal, as we know. And the sixth is social reproduction, which I think it's really Rodrigo's bet in a way, because for Rodrigo, social reproduction is something that can bind. Like in the end of the book, you see that very clearly. Like Rodrigo pictures social reproduction as that which can be one of the things that bind the local to the global, because it's something in which people can recognize themselves. So it's something that like has this like in the sense, it's an easy way to map yourself it's an easy debate to map yourself cognitively within where you are in social reproduction, but also it is something that like can resonate in a global scale and can be spoken of in a global scale. And that for Rodrigo has this role of mediating, or could also have this role of helping to mediate between different very different nodes within the same ecology. So yeah, these are pretty much like the definitions of the conjuncture that Rodrigo's exploring, and how Rodrigo sort of reads our own predicament. And what are the concepts that will help us navigate it? So first, yeah, tendency, composition, and complexity, which I have spoken about. And then after these, like the book has a shift in that. I think these are chapters like 4 and 5 or 5 and 6, I'm not sure. But like there is a shift in the book at that particular juncture, like when Rodrigo starts, like he makes 2 chapters, which are sort of like in which he explores concepts as analyzing this conjuncture. So he starts on part 1 exploring 5 concepts. So it's ecology, distributed leadership, organizing course, Vanguard function, and diffuse control. And again, all these concepts are lumped together. Like they are not really, some of them are clearly defined, some of them are not so clearly defined. What I try to do is sort of like, how do I get the places in which they are defined the clearest, or have like the best example possible to actually like make people be able to understand like why they should read the book, and like what is interesting about the trajectory and like the combination between these concepts. And on the part 2, we're talking about platforms, the concept of what he calls a diversity of strategies, and also what would be the role of parties within a certain ecology. Let me see my time. It's gonna work. Yeah, it's gonna work. Yeah, about ecology. So the first thing that he talks about ecology is that ecology is a discourse itself that arises out of a certain fever of the network paradigm. I find it very interesting because like there is one book in particular that I was always like recalling when I was reading that part, which is Alexander Galloway's book on like Protocol, which is a book about the internet. And it's funnily enough, one of the things, like Galloway was advised by Michael Hart, right? Like when writing that, which is like his PhD thesis. And one of the main critiques that he makes is that like the network paradigm is generalized as an idea of connectivity, as an abstract idea, but that actually like there is not like if you would pay attention to how networks are actually being created in the world, you would be surprised of like the types of hierarchies that they create and how they combine the vertical and the horizontal ways of control. And for this, he's talking about like internet protocols, so TCP, IP, and how like this, how the internet itself is conditioned by this working nodes. So I think it's a very good practical example of like the type of critique that Rodrigo was doing, but in a very focused setting on like a specific media infrastructure. So yeah, for Rodrigo, the main good thing about like the ecology paradigm is that the recognition that by acting on one shared environment, you can indirectly shape each other's field of possibilities, both positively and negatively. And that a healthy ecology needs several actors that combine the ability to intervene at certain key points of the chain with the capacity to think the chain as a whole. So in that sense, the connection between ecology and distributed leaderships comes precisely through these like several actors that would like combine these abilities of intervention. If you look what he's talking about, like he wants to have a concept of leadership as a function. And for leadership as a function to emerge, it should be a leadership that is, as he says, never fully stabilized in the hands of any individual, concentrated in a position or formalized into a selection procedure. At the limit, it is undistinguishable from the role played by the member on the edge of the pack. And here he's quoting Deleuze and Guattari, of course, and its cutting edge of deterritorialization, when it is capable of steering the group's course at a given moment, pulling it in a new direction, changing its shape and structure as it goes. This does not mean that the leadership function has ceased to exist, but rather that instead of being fixed, it circulates. So when he talks about distributed leaderships, he's talking about this capacity of like, how do you actually have a certain environment within an ecology that could be either like the full ecology and considering different organizations leading a certain struggle, or it could be like within a smaller organization, how the leadership function circulates between people. And then he talks about organizing cores as something like about an initiative. So an organizing core would be the following. So the more complex and durable an initiative is, the more likely that one or more relatively stable organizing cores will begin to form, which may or may not include the original initiators. Organizing cores emerge naturally out of collective processes by responding to their increasingly complex demands. Their formation and stabilization depends on a combination of such factors as resource availability, free time, experience, social capital, aptitudes, interpersonal skills, tactical news, capacity to reconcile different perspectives, external recognition, prestige, respect, being a contact person, functional diversification, specialization, network and group formation dynamics, preferential attachment, betweenness, personal ties, political affinity, trust, and common interests. So within every initiative for Rodrigo, you could have these organizing cores, which could be like, if we're using like a very vulgar metaphor of like company, let's say we're talking about something that's like different areas within a company, for example, being different like organizing cores. Or if we're talking about let's say if we talk about like the process of ourselves making the atlas, for example, we had a certain, like we had one part of like, while every text was sort of like its own being led by one person, so one person was actually leading each of like these nodes of what we wanted to organize. We had a strong like we had an organizing core in like the general sessions, for example, in which we had to like bring together a few people that would that actually like had a number of particular insights within the project, and that they could actually like sort of steer the experiment and make something that would attempt to be unifying that. But that function was often like circulating between like the, when we were writing, like between different people from the group, like particular people from the group that had more expertise in like a certain way. So I don't know, Yasha was doing the diagrams, Gabrielle was doing like some of the introductions, and then each of us, of course, were working within our own specialty, but also referring to that particular diagram as something that would be able to actually like organize the whole endeavor. And the other thing is the Vanguard function. So the Vanguard function for Rodrigo, if we are in a situation in which there are several organizing cores that possess large zones of influence without crossing the threshold between which they become too big to fail, A certain equilibrium among hubs means that they can neutralize each other to some extent, making it harder for a winner-takes-it-all dynamic to set in. Not only keeps any single center of power from becoming too autonomous, but leaves space open for new vanguard functions to emerge. Yet, the preservation of this equilibrium is itself constantly balanced against the imperative to act. And every action can both create new power differentials and strengthen those that already exist. Once more, it is the ecology's very functioning and the extent to which initiatives are successful that destabilizes the system and potentially undermines the diffuse democratic control. So what he's talking about here, like, and it's very similar to what he says when he talks about like a temporary leadership function, that like this vanguard function is mainly like, if you think about like within a group, how in different situations for different initiatives, a particular group of people or like one person in particular could be leading that group within that project, but then the danger of that, so like the danger of these potential turning into like a potestas is actually if the whole ecology itself has of that particular organization has room for that function to be contested or to be like rotatively distributed, which does not mean to be necessarily like an enforcement of that. So we don't have to like, okay, you're too much time doing that, so like you're going to become like the vanguard function will crystallize, but it's more about the possibility of doing so. So the possibility of contesting rather than just like a mechanism that would do that by default. It could be that mechanism itself, but it doesn't have to be. It could be just like something that circulates within that particular organization and the way that it works between people, like the personal relationships, whatever. And when he talks about diffuse control, he's particularly mentioned class. And the main way in which he's doing so is that it's by the insight that for class, the emergence of unaccountable and coercive forms of power should be explained less by themselves than by the incapacity of the social field to exercise them. So he uses that metaphor, like when he's talking about like cluster zones ethnographies, he uses that as the way of actually like taking into account what he wants to do with organization. So that becomes the main blueprint of like what is happening over there. I remember that like when I was talking to Jean about it, we were a little bit puzzled about like why would we need clusters over there, like, because you could have just made that point without going back to it. But I think that this is what he wants with like the extensive discussion of cluster. Like he wants these hypotheses to be applied for like for organizations themselves in different levels, not only to this social field, but actually like to transport that insight to the task of organizing as such, not only to like the abstraction that is a social field or a social organization. Gabriel, yeah.
No, I mean, the explanation is very simple. He's literally a Karatani follower. He's literally taking everything from mode A at a higher level.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, also
you
that
reciprocity prevents the state from appearing. It prevents vanguards from becoming autonomous. It's literally mode A at a higher level.
Yeah, because from the perspective...
Mode A again? Mode A is...
It's just a logic of gifts.
Okay.
Community, yeah. So like this idea of community, because Clusters has a book that tells that certain societies, state never appears because they constantly act in such a way as to prevent it to appear by every time you accumulate too much power, you only remain powerful if you give it away, right? So it sounds a lot like he's more Karatani-esque than we are.
Yeah, so sorry, I was using that particular rest time to actually take a look at the chat to see if something crazy was happening. But yeah, I think what we were most puzzled about was that like the appearance of clusters for that particular chapter, it doesn't help explaining what the chapter wants to explain, but it is a very important signal to like the general theoretical commitments that it wants to have, right? Because it's not particularly like elucidative of what is there, like from the perspective of the reader, but definitely like it puts him within this certain tradition of like the return of waiting for the return of bringing forth the return perhaps of mode A in a higher level. But I think that here, like the important difference that he has with Karatani is that he has much more, he also doesn't need like mode D in a way. He doesn't need this moment, because precisely what the critique that he does of the idea of revolution would be, I think he could apply that not with all the impact that it has, but he could charge Karatani's reliance on a mode D as this regulative ideal through his own critique of revolution. He could do that, and I think that like it would be a brilliant way to also critique Karatani, that like perhaps Karatani is still reliant on that mode D for having an outdated concept of revolution, even like being left as an horizon. So I think in a weird way, Karatani's resort to mode D as that X is a way, is like a symptom of what he's diagnosing that is wrong with the concept of revolution. I think that would be like an interesting way to put them together. About diffuse control also. So when he's talking about diffuse control, he's talking about, and this is like particularly what he has in mind, the threat of suspension of cooperation and exclusion from networks, from people that are actually like disrupting a certain network. So both of those being, as Boltanski and Chapello observed, tantamount to death in a network world. The absence of a formal accountability is in that way compensated for by a form of diffuse control. Once again, force over form. So this is that very like, you don't really have to resort to the authority of someone to, let's say like you have someone doing something stupid in a WhatsApp group, and then you don't have to really like ask for the admin to kick that person out. You can just either go there and kick her out, or like you can also like together with the rest of the people just ostracize that person until she leaves. I mean, there is a lot of ways of that diffuse control to be like exerted within a certain like very vulgar example. And I failed to translate that slide because it shouldn't be there. Yeah. Yeah, it should have been deleted. And the final elements, I made this sort of grid for them because differently from these other ones, they don't really have that big conceptual core. They are just like very diluted within the argument. So I thought it would be best to just go through some bullet points and organize them in that way. So the three elements as we had them: platform, the diversity of practices, and party. So for the platform, he's talking about the platform as a socio-technical political organizational form. We'll see what that means shortly. And platform as the place in which like politics is mostly realized, and also that platforms itself as a form of socio-technical organizational form inspires the way politics itself can be unfolded. And in particular, when he talks about the organizing core, he has a platform in mind as the main analogy for that. And on diversity of practices, he's talking about like first how different organizations could unite themselves within different struggles, on the tension between order and diversity, and also on that fact that I spoke about, that social reproduction can be the alliance maker of that. And third, when he talks about the party, that the party has this main role in mediation. So that the party itself can be the main role in mediating an ecology in a particular way, which we're going to see very soon. So about the platform, he talks about like a platform politics, and organizing cores initiate collective action by inviting participation around a pre-established object. It's very interesting here because like I sense the Galloway thing that I was mentioning earlier, and like the media theory whole thing over again, because there is a lot of this book that is inspired by this insight that you can use a socio-technical form of organization as a blueprint to understand both the possibilities of doing politics and also like the blueprint for how politics can be done in a certain conjuncture. And I think this is a fascinating like insight that appears in this book, and it's not obvious at all. Like it's something that it has some very locatable arguments within media theory and such, but I've never seen it put in that particular way. I think it's very interesting. I mean, you guys can see why I would be infatuated with that after I made like a 1.5 hour presentation showing like diagrams of machines and diagrams of like social domination. So you guys can see why I like it in general, and like my own infatuation with it. But anyway, organizing cores initiate collective action by inviting participation around a pre-established object, so a target, goal, a narrative of where that fits in a broader picture. Second would be a set of protocols, which is type of action, levels of risk and commitment for participation, overall messaging and profile, red lines, hashtags, and some resources. So visual identity, guidelines, downloadable materials, online forums, geolocalized maps, protest infrastructure, legal aid, press packs, whatever. And there is, of course, a fair deal of variation as to what resources are provided and how vaguely or restrictively the objects and protocols are defined. Some, for example, might emphasize a more militant identity, seeking to attract support mostly from individuals who already self-describe as activists and demand a narrower agreement with the overall proposal. Others may take a more inclusive approach, appealing to a broader constituency, expecting more minimal agreement and providing opportunities for less demanding participation. And it's interesting here that he's talking about like very different modes of organization and of the possibility of different levels of commitment within one organization itself as such, but also between these different nodes of organization within an organization. And the diversity of tactics and strategies, he talks about, he has this long discussion of like the difference between ruptural, interstitial, and symbiotic approaches to social change. This comes from Eric Olin Wright, right? And for him, the fact, like, while he likes that distinction, he also thinks that that distinction is too much in the level of like making a conceptual apparatus for social change, rather than actually looking at the conjuncture and at the practices that are being developed over there to actually develop that. But he uses that as like a useful heuristics for thinking. And when he talks about diversity of strategies and tactics, he's talking about mainly like how each of the nodes of an organization, but also these different organizations can have different tactics within the same ecology, and both of them be seen as positive. So you can have, for example, like both a violent and electoral tactic that see each other not as like a derogatory thing. So like, oh yeah, this is just like violence, never the answer, or some like liberal bullshit like that. And then, but instead you can see both of these nodes, like the node that chooses political violence and the one that doesn't, for their qualities and like for what they are good and what they are bad in certain like in a strategic level for, and which tactics should they use in that time. And this is a very interesting thing, I think, because while he also he doesn't let that distinction between ruptural, interstitial, and symbiotic go away, he also claims that it is ultimately a sort of like distinction that works too much at the conceptual level. So just for those not that familiar with that, we had a very good presentation about that in CPC from Mateus. That was really interesting. But mainly like a ruptural change would be the type of change in which like you have a certain node of an organization having like fully rupturing with what was happening before. An interstitial one would be one in which like you form something within that organization that works by itself and then tries to expand. So like, let's say just a commune or something. And a symbiotic one would be one in which like that form of organization becomes something that feeds off your own capacity of futurely overcoming that. So yeah, these three approaches serve as a sort of heuristics for Rodrigo, but the main outcome is that strategies and tactics should be conciled not as like exclusive choices, but actually like as different choices within the same ecology, and that like these people can relate to that ecology. And about the party form, there is like the last bit. Rather, it is that part of the ecology that performs a function no other organization does, devising electoral strategies, fielding candidates, occupying parliament. This sounds very funny with like the occupation of capital, like in a way, because you could, anyway, eventually running government. To do so, it must, as Dean says, respond to the ecology, which it does by attempting to translate its diffuse desires and demands into policy, seeking to attract other social sectors to its sphere of influence and maintaining some degree of accountability towards it. That does not, however, appear to involve the aspiration to promote organizational integration under a single umbrella. Members and non-members alike seem to perceive the party not so much as the telos of the ecology, what at once crowns it and makes it a whole, but as an organization providing a unique kind of service. This metaphor is very interesting, like to use the metaphor of service for the party. I think it's a very interesting term of events. In this case, rather than tending towards a merger, party and ecology retain their separation. trying to maintain instead a two-way mutually beneficial relationship, whereas the party offers the ecology the possibility of intervening at the level of the state. The ecology offers the votes and engagements that give the party a core base from which to build electoral coalitions. So final notes on that. I can't believe I finished within an hour. And yes, I feel accomplished for the day. The totality as such for Rodrigo never acts. So you always have like these partial actions which respond and have ways of parsing out within a whole ecology. Second, leadership for Rodrigo is interesting because while he diffuses leadership, he admits, and here once again, Rodrigo is a very good political realist in a way, and like that leadership is politics' ineliminable feature. So it is something that like politics cannot really transcend leadership. What it can do is actually build structures for leadership to be as rotative and as transferable and as contestable as possible. Organization is a way to raise collective potential which has the risk of crystallizing into potestas. So we started Pharmacon, we ended Pharmacon also. And the question of rupture becomes the main question from the end of the book. And Rodrigo's bet here's where he bets on social reproduction as that which can make connections within an ecology. And yeah, there's a good bit about it. And let me see if this is, I think, yeah. So for Rodrigo, the best we can hope for is that most participants of an ecology embody an ethos of acting ecologically, non-competitively, without a narcissistic investment in their own protagonism, placing the health and the interests of the ecology as a whole above their own and or their organizations, and that the ecology retains a capacity for diffuse control that can ensure that evil opportunists will also be bad ones. So that would be it. Yeah, ending in that note, I think there is one thing that like, because it's interesting that like the whole presentation arcs between what we end with is actually like a hope for participants to embody an ethos. And I don't know, it sort of felt like at the end, it felt really crazy as an end to this book, because one would imagine that there would be something about that ecology itself that this would boil down to a different definition of what an ecology can do. But then we actually have like what the ecology can do as such becomes a function of like that individual ethos of acting. So I think like the book is very circular in that sense. Like you come back to the first issue, but still the difference is that you can see it with like 1,000 other tools that you didn't have at the beginning. So that's what I think makes it really good. And yeah, I'm gonna shut up and take some water because my throat.
Let's take a little break, man, so you can actually drink more water than just a sip.
Oh yeah, that
man, but that was amazing. Like I don't know how you managed to summarize this book in 1 hour. That was.
I don't know either. I feel like my thoughts are like popping out. I never spoke like that in my life.
Okay, man. Okay, let's take 5 minutes and then we come back. Rafael's already gone. Like they're not even at the second. Okay, be right back.
I'm lurking. You're wrong.
Rafa, antes da gente entrar no debate, a gente tinha ficado só de mencionar coisa da vaquinha para passagem e tal. Vou só mencionar ali para a gente não deixar passar.
Boa, boa.
The little cow.
The little cow. Is everyone back already? No, right?
I don't know. I think
I don't.
We're probably good.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, because we forgot to mention this at the beginning. It has nothing to do with the presentation. It's just, I mean, a couple of meetings ago, we mentioned that we were trying to. I mean, I remember. Don't know if you guys remember, but Rafael did like a short 8-minute video explaining an idea that we were doing in terms of some changes. Like one of them we implemented already, which is doing 1-hour presentations rather than 3-hour ones. One of them was trying to create like a Patreon to start kind of creating some cash, some funds that we can use to different activities in the circle, in the STP. But one of the things that is going on recently is that we're trying to organize a meeting here in Brazil of all the Brazilian people in the STP. And that involves paying for some plane tickets to get them to come to the same city. And we're also trying to translate the text that we're going to publish at Crisis and Critique, so that we have a common text in Portuguese that we all can use to kind of discuss and work on top. But that costs some money. So we thought of doing like an internal fundraising campaign, just to see if anyone can contribute, so we can kind of join some cash and pay for these tickets. There are not that many, in fact.
Yeah, I wanted to give an update like about that, because I don't wanna take the funds, because I'm not sure if I'm gonna be able to come, and I'm probably gonna only have a response like very soon in the time, like when very by the end of this week. So I don't wanna like burden the group with that. I think it can easily go to somebody else, and I'm fine with like.
Yeah, but I mean, before we even decide that, we should see how much we can raise, like if everyone joins in, and then I mean, it might not even cover the cost for the plane tickets anyway. But just so, I think a lot of people are not here today, so I'm just gonna write about this afterwards in the WhatsApp group. I'm not sure if anyone has any idea on how we should go about this. I think one thing that's obvious that we could do is just do like after the event in Brazil, we do something back at the Monday meetings to account for how it went, give a report, like, so it's of benefit to everyone.
Yeah.
Something like this. But the idea is to do a closed event in Rio where everyone gets to meet, because many of us never met, and then a public event like the day after, so we got a chance to present a bit of the ideas we've been developing. So it will definitely make our work better known, help us to undo this problem we've been having, which has a lot to do with Rodrigo's concern with organizing cores and diffusing control, which is actually creating enough connections amongst people that you don't have like hubs that know everyone, where other people don't know anyone, because then it's very hard for other people to feel like they can take the project ahead more autonomously, right? So so that's an idea we had on tape. I'm not sure if anyone has any specific thoughts on how to go about it, but my idea was just to post it on the WhatsApp group afterwards, so we can decide and chat how to do it if everyone is up for it.
Yeah, how does the fundraising looks logistically? Just to ask something, like is it gonna be like we accept like where does it get like aggregated? Where could we have like a picture, like in terms of like who do I send money if I want to do something?
Yeah, I think, well, one thing we know is that Renzo is keeping the current funds that we have, and that's an international account. Probably there's no weird conversion going on if anyone who's not in Brazil wants to send money to help. And perhaps we could have a Brazilian person for people who want to contribute in reais, since the money is going to be spent in Brazil. This way it doesn't need to be converted to dollars or something and then back to reais.
And we have Pix also, which like has no transaction costs. So it's just Yeah, I would suggest doing that because then like you just centralize everything in someone like in an account that has a fix, and then like because it's easy for Renzo to pass like from his own account to one particular account, like from PayPal. Like it takes 1 to 5 days. Like, I get paid there, and yeah, and the conversion is not that bad. And I think it's easier than to do like through IBAN, because if you do through IBAN, there is a lag between when you get that. Like it usually takes within like 7 days for you to get. So it's just best to do like it's just best to use PayPal for that. So I would suggest.
There's also this Uber type of conversion, which is called RTM, which is like it's an Uber because you have people with accounts on the two currencies, and then they do the conversion rate for you, and it's a bit cheaper also than. So it's also a possibility besides, and it's immediately. I think it's not a.
Yeah. There's also Wise, which is like significantly lower than what you usually pay through like, through bank to bank international transfers, and it's much faster. Like you get wired in like.
Another thing that I think it's worth mentioning is that I think we should try to follow this idea of doing this in Brazil with trying to do it in the States afterwards, you know. And again, everyone could pitch in because there's Dennis, Yasha, John, Reza is around. Like we could come up with an activity of the similar sort, you know, to again try to do the same thing in preparation for our first international conference at some point in the next 20 years, which is the hardest one to pull off. But
come on, we can do in the next 5 years, I think.
Let's wait until after October to have that conversation.
You go somewhere like in the middle. I don't know.
We can all meet in Panama or something.
Yeah, we all meet in Panama. That would be that would be perfect.
Okay.
We can start driving there now. Rent a bus and we start going up. They rent a bus and they go down. Anyway, just wanted to bring this up because it's something we're trying to organize here. I think it would make a big difference, and we didn't have a chance to bring it up yet and talk to everyone about it. So, but I'll post it on WhatsApp as well as like a kind of urgent thing.
Oh yeah, I think there's another urgent thing. Is there were you going to say anything else, Gabriel?
No, please.
We are going. This is on Zulus, but we have the crisis and critique text. We have a deadline for 1st September, so it would be good that we finish the text before. As Gabriel said on the group, it's been transcribed, and then he has rewritten stuff over the transcription. And we are at a stage where I think it's the point for everyone to intervene, to change, to edit. But I think we have to do this, since we have little time, we have to do it in a more focused manner. So I proposed for a meeting I think it's the 3rd. I think it's next week on a Wednesday. I scheduled that meeting based on the potential Baju group meeting because it was a date available for people. And what I thought, I mean, these are some ideas for how to do this, but we can talk about it in that meeting, is that like, I think there are 2 kinds of interventions. I would encourage everyone to like read this version that has been edited and transcribed, like, and put comments, like not the comments on the side. And I think this would be a way like of knowing, even if people can't attend the meeting, they can just start putting their ideas. And then in the meeting, we can either like schedule another meeting and add more comments, or we can just in the meeting decide how we are going to edit the text from the comments. And we can like say, okay, so I'm going to do these edits, I'm going to do these suggestions, and so on. This is just like a suggestion because since we have little time, I think we have to be a bit more focused and militarized in this. The Vanguard function is on for this bit, I think. But that's all.
Yeah, I just finished doing the revision. It's a bit too long. Like I think we can go up to 12K so 12,000 words, and it's now 14. So the first thing, if whoever wants to help, it would be to edit it down. There's a lot of things you can take out because it's just a transcription of the lecture, you know. So probably if somebody could look at it and say, okay, this could be totally removed, all these sections. This would open up places where we can then add new things, or people can just say, I want to rewrite all this passage in a different language, different terms. Like there's space to do all of that, you know. So just consider it as a skeleton.
When will be the meeting for that? It will be on a Wednesday. I forgot when it will be.
Next
next
Wednesday.
Next one. Okay.
Yeah, the 3rd August, August 3rd.
Yeah, usually we have CPC. We'll see, yeah, but yeah, we'll see about that.
But I think we can, I mean, it's the sort of thing we can talk through Zulip. I mean, even if you don't go to the meeting, if you just, it should be a short one. So just look into it and then,
Okay.
I mean, it should be seen as an ongoing thing, like we did with the Atlas. Like,
Yeah.
we work more outside of the meetings than in the meetings, right?
Okay, fine.
Yeah, I think that's good with me too.
So yeah, just to go back to the discussion then, I've read the book a while back, Rafael, but let me know if you think this is a okay summary of it, because it's so much stuff. It's hard to summarize, but now that you presented it, you chewed the whole content in this way, I think I have a better grasp on how I would summarize the basic proposal, and also a bit more clarity on where I think it's like the challenge that makes it hard to transcribe. Like what makes it easy to do some comparisons between what he's doing and what we've been working on, and what makes it hard. Like my impression is that, like, if you were to summarize the argument of the book in like one kind of short narrative, is there's enough, like we know enough after the 20th century to know that we cannot count on social tendencies producing automatically a revolutionary subject just out of the economic social movement of society. We know that like we can see from the current state of the left field that we can have conflicts within the left that are kind of stable conflicts. They never get solved. So there is no necessary convergence between leftist organizations. So you get this idea that on some level, there is less structure we can count on than we thought. We need to construct more than we thought we would have to construct. Then I feel like the first big thesis of the book is that, yeah, but that doesn't mean you should start from nothing, from like flat ontology or whatever. You can start from the fact that everything is already organized. It's just not necessarily political. And even if it is political, it's not necessarily of one form or a stable form or recognizable form. So for him, you need to start then from a theory of organization that is general enough to accept this Bogdanov idea that there is no such thing as total disorganization. Like everything is minimally organized at least, because otherwise we wouldn't even know it exists. So it must have some structure. So you should start from that. I feel like his political realism is pretty much that idea, like realism in the sense that it's where you don't see organization, you're not being realist enough, because people actually are organized in some way, perhaps not just the way you want them to be. And then I feel like everything else kind of follows from there. Like, okay, if you don't take for granted that you have some tendencies, teleological necessity of producing a subject that will be able to impose a form on history, blah, 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 how do you actually build together these parts of society? How do you construct this, right? And I think that those are most of the tools that he develops, right? Are based on this, like how do you organize without being sure that these things will be a given? Do you think that's an okay summary?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much like what the vibe of the book tries to be about, and I think it really works through these failures in a lot of ways, and you can sort of see what he's getting at when you look at like each of these each of the chapters. It has something it tries to solve. in particular. And I agree. I think this is a very interesting summary. One of the things that has fascinated me, like as a feature of the book, though, that I would really add, is this attempt to actually go, because I think it is relevant, right? It is this attempt to actually use the forms of organization as they are concretized in like in our own social order to actually theorize the possibilities of changing that social order and doing politics within that social order. So because I think that this is a very, at the same time that it is a sort of obvious insight, if you look at like past revolutionary processes and whatever, it is something that has been lost precisely of the way that the question of organization has disappeared. And I think that the book tries to rescue that, and rescuing that has a lot of these implications of also reviewing some of the mistakes of the 20th century. I think that it's a very nice summary.
But then what I would ask and like bring to the discussion, see what you think of it. Like, I feel like I could list a lot of kind of similarities of the sort, like to take first to depoliticize organization and make it into a point of view to look at everything in social life. So going to church every weekend is a way of organizing. Why not? A lot of people are together, blah, 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 blah. So it's a general point of view. And then you ask questions about under which conditions is this political, rather than inverting and saying, we will only consider organized things which are politically organized, right? The second, I think, is that the question you posed right at the beginning, right? Rather than asking what is the proper, perfect organizational form, ask how, given that there are many political organizations, how can they complement each other? So the whole thing about composing, blah, blah, seems very similar. I really like, I think it's very similar also when he says that for him, the masses make history actually means something like, it takes large organizations to make large changes. Like there is some principle of homogeneity. You cannot expect small to make big. You need big to change big, right? I think we have a version of that, which is a bit more nuanced, where we say like, well, different forms of composition affect different social phenomena, but the same principles seem to apply. Then the fact that he takes perspectivism seriously as a sort of the embedded point of view in a situation, right? He's very much a standpoint theorist. He just doesn't think that a standpoint necessarily leads to political power. You still need to compose the standpoints, right? I think that's also kind of similar. Then
that's a very nice description, like,
right,
of him as like a standpoint theorist, because I have that, because the standpoint here for Rodrigo is, I think it is an oscillation between the standpoint of the organization and the standpoint of the ecology. And what he wants to make is sort of like, how do we make the ecology visible from within the organization?
Yeah, perfect.
The organization and its goals. I think that that's very apt, like seeing it as a perspectivism in that way is a really...
Yeah, because he uses this thing about second order cybernetics, which kind of localizes the observer in the system to say, look, you never get the full picture, so you're always local with partial information. But the more you're thinking about the system you're inside of, the better you're able to share resources, connect to other organizations, like the last quote you showed, right? Then I think he has a very similar, which it's interesting. He arrives at our kind of discussion of, you know, hybrid social formations. You cannot really count on social homogeneity, blah, 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 blah. Not from this kind of pseudo-sociological point of view of, look at Brazil, for example, you know, perspectives don't add up, even though they're both political. He starts from failed revolutions and say, we counted on teleology, we counted on increasing homogeneity, that didn't happen. But the end result is similar, which is you need to assume heterogeneity, assume that just because locally there is a political actor, that doesn't mean it's universalizable automatically, and so on and so forth, right? And I think that there's another point that is also very similar, is his interest in that triad of strategies, ruptural, interstitial, and symbiotic, which he also claims that are actually mixed in real life. They're more like pure conceptual forms, which again sounds a lot like what we've been doing with this idea that the forms of negation of mode A, mode B, and mode C, like dual power, insurrectionism, and like correlation of forces, they're actually pure versions. In reality, they're mixed together, right? So there's also very similarities there, a lot of similarities. Where I find the differences, and I tend to be very generous with this because I know the inverse also happens. Like people of a more kind of Marxist Hegelian type of formation, like their jargon comes from there. They tend to make a scarecrow of the Deleuzian Negrian. They want fluidity. They want everything's the same. They think everything's a mixture. It's like we make a scarecrow so we can make our position clearer. And perhaps he makes a bit of that when he, you know, Lukácsians are about ideal forms or too much concept and too little kind of realism, which I think it's fine. Like I think, you know, it's a really good way of making the argument, but it's it points to a funny thing about his project, which I think is what makes it hard sometimes to translate it, like the more propositional things or prescriptive things to what we've been doing, which is the model in my head, at least, for how Rodrigo operates with his more nuanced distinctions is to create a grid, like a scale, and then add nuance. Like you're thinking too binarily, there is a nuance between those two things, and that's a pragmatic nuance. So conceptual opposition is too either or, it's too P or not P. But real forces, they can actually, you know, there's a gradient of more to this side, more to that side. You know, generally everything is more solved towards something which goes towards the language of the pragmatic. Decide in the moment the degree in which you should invest in this approach rather than that. And don't commit to this fully because your commitment is to a bigger project, not to this immediate thing, right? Commit to the ecology first and be pragmatic in your local decisions, something like this. So the word of the day is always mixture, nuance, choosing every, like, singularly to each conjuncture what is a proper way of going, right? Which I think is fine. Like, I think the book, in my opinion, now that I saw your presentation, it's clearly more directed to organizers than anything. It's not a book for theoreticians. It's a book for people who need words to convince themselves they can be a bit more nuanced in practice, you know, and to convince them that they are working with others and not against other people on the left. It's not a book to theorize the perfect discourse. So that might justify this particular thing. But it's curious because we worked with a very kind of triadic structure. Like, we never get to put a position in between two extremes, right? Because we work with like 3 or 4 logics at the same time, you never really get to say this is in between two things. Like, that's not really how we introduce nuance. We introduce nuance by adding dimensions, right? So you thought something was describable by one logic, you actually need to describe it by at least 4 points, where it stands with regard to reciprocities, contracts, value, and communist potential, or whatever. So we're more like a manifold kind of grammar. There are more dimensions to things, where he's more of a kind of fuzzy grammar. Like, there are more nuance to the side of the vicinity of where you are, right? So we actually end up talking more in terms of what composition goes with what change, right? And he goes more with like, what is the fitting place in a scale to that situation? It's a slightly different approach, which makes total sense if he's talking to organizers. He's not talking to people who want to distinguish logics. He's talking to people who are always in the mix of already mixed things. So a language of mixture sounds more appropriate, perhaps, you know? So I don't know, I wanted to hear you about these things, like if you think they make sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think because like for me, this book, and I don't know, I have been obsessed with this. Like, Rodrigo's really trying to make like and succeeding to a certain extent, at least, to like give an update of political realism that is very singular. It is very different because it doesn't really rely on what we are used with, let's say, like the way that political realism appears within leftist theory, let's say Laclau, for example. Like it is a really sui generis type of development because it tries to make these it tries to attach itself to this question of the conjuncture. So like the gradient is always only a gradient insofar as it is the form of appearance of that like impasse, which is sort of like synthetic within a conjuncture. But like, so he's really like someone that wants to look at this front of appearance and try to make something out of them. So I agree with you that it is like it is a book for organizers first and foremost, but then it also puts the question of theorizing from that with that type of commitment. And I think that this is a question that like appears, for instance, like in Machiavelli, and it appears also in how Gramsci and Althusser read him, which is the fact that like, what does it mean to theorize from the conjuncture, and like what does it take to theorize from the conjuncture? Because it takes in the last instance both an extreme like attachment to one's own situation, but also that from that attachment one thing like the new can be born from that attachment to that situation, and that has to be, and that you have to dislocate the place of that conjuncture. So like the conjuncture has to be dislocated, so it generates this eerie odd feeling that like that these distinctions have, and then something that exceeds the grammar of what is usual, like about writing about politics, starts to appear. And I think this is true of Gramsci, for example. This is true of Althusser in his own way, but less, but also like the particular nexus through which I read Machiavelli. So I think that what he's trying to reverse, that like his philosophical take is to actually like not really like talk, aim to the organizers, but like aim at the organizers and try to speculate what doing that means for philosophy, perhaps. And there are moments in which he does that. There are moments in which like in that particularly like daunting part about like the real opposition and conceptual opposition is one of these attempts. So I think that what we might see in his upcoming book, which is about the problem of transition and revolution, and like we'll delve into that, we might see more of the philosophical side, in my opinion, because I think like it should appear like perhaps what he's doing, like he's starting to, like he's getting there, like I think, because it has like these implications will be fully fleshed out for like in some time, I think, like when digesting the book and everything. That's what I think. Victor, you have your hand. Sorry.
Okay. Hello. First time I'm talking here. I'm Victor. I'm a journalist, and I come from an autonomist or horizontalist background, and I think the book is very good. The presentation was very good. It got the most points of the book. I think it will be very useful for people who visit our site, so they buy the book. I agree with Gabriel. It is a book that is directed to militants. So people who not just people who are in organizations, but people who have participated in the struggles since the 2000s. So people who participated in the global action, ação global dos povos,
People's Global Action. I don't know.
People's Global Action, the summit. These people and the people now who are starting politics now, and it is also directed to the older generation of people who in Europe and United States and Brazil fought for the establishment of rights in some manner or another through mass organizations, and that was the norm everywhere. Even in autonomous Italy, it was autonomous, but it was massive organizations of workers. It was not the model of small groups of autonomous collectives that we have in Brazil today. And what I think the book tries to do, and is very successful in doing in a very convincing way, is changing the mindset of the militant. Because the militant, from my experience, thinks society from the point of view of the inside of the organization to society. So if society isn't accepting the politics of organization, the problem lies with society, or the problem lies with another organization that is still in the spot. And what Rodrigo proposes is that we take a step back and see that the left and social movements and a possible revolution will not be composed by a single organization or a form of organization, but an ecology. So, but it is an attempt to restructure the perspective of the militants about their participation in struggles and how they view other organizations and spontaneous popular participation. So it is sort of an antidote, I don't know how it is in English, antidote to paranoia and conspiratorial thinking that other organizations are not trying to fulfill their objectives, they're out to get you, or that popular insurgents is an orange, a color revolution and whatever. Everything is a process of organization. You are part of a larger process. You have to realize that when you do the analysis of conjuncture. I think that is a very important point, and it allows a broader range of actions, a more flexible approach to organizational form. You can, when you are working in an environment that is more hostile, you can maybe be more hierarchical and centralize information. When you work in a place that is tolerant to union organization, like an university, you can be more democratic and more horizontal. So organization is related to context, it is related to various other things and not ideological principles alone or purity. And that is how he takes the revolutionary out of organization, in the sense that it is not your specific organization that will bring about revolution. It is the revolutionary process in which you will participate in an organized manner. I think the objective of this argument is to stop, to make the Brazilian left, or the word left, I don't know, less sectarian and more flexible and more capable of making agreements, or not necessarily explicit agreements, but tolerating more that there will be actions outside your control, and they are not necessarily bad. They can be not what you want to do, but maybe they are reinforcing your agenda. You have to think about the agenda that is being reinforced by this ecology, not if your organization is growing or not, which is the manner most militants look at political processes. What I think Rodrigo underestimates, or maybe doesn't, or maybe it is deliberate that he does not put this in the book, is when the left is in power, or when it is necessary to pursue process of hegemony to be able to achieve a political objective. So there are certain political objectives by certain organizations. For example, let's think South Africa. The ANC had to establish hegemony over all other organizations in the anti-apartheid struggle to be able to make a deal, pacify the country, and become president. So they had to suppress other organizations, and at that moment, it was no longer an ecology for a common purpose. It was something else. So that moment, the scheme, the model proposed by Rodrigo doesn't quite get it. And I think it is an important flaw. I think that's what I wanted to think of. I think Rodrigo made sort of presuppose that there will be no antagonism between the left. It is a model that presupposes mutual. It is like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were not against each other, but eventually one of the lines of the movement prevailed, and it was the neoliberal one. It wasn't Malcolm X. And how did this happen? There was an internal struggle in the process of social change that led to that result. So I think it is an advance to think beyond your organization, but we need to think contradictions and struggles within the ecology to be able to understand what will happen, why organizations are behaving as they are, and so on. That's it. Thanks.
Let me just draw something. So what you're saying mainly is that like Rodrigo lacks there's a lackluster step, which is the fact that like he doesn't admit that perhaps like the only thing that can break with the left for Rodrigo is like the opposition of the right, let's say, but like he doesn't admit really like that this infighting can itself become like a source of like an extreme breakdown like within a certain ecology, and like that these extreme breakdown could have like sort of like disastrous consequences. And I think I agree in a way with like to a certain point with what you're saying. I think it's a really perceptive thing.
Yeah, I think one of the ways of understanding that is that in those points, I think his answer would be almost like evolution. Like, well, Martin Luther King was more fit to the situation, so he survives. You know, Malcolm X is less fitted to the situation, perhaps. Like, probably that dynamic inside would be kind of a metaphor of, you know, natural evolution. System evolves, a part of it can grow and parasitize the whole thing, or like. But I agree with you, because everything is the logic of mixture. It's very hard to see antagonism inside the left, right? I can definitely, I feel a similar problem. One thing I wanted to see what you guys think also is, I mean, one thing that I think is very good, I can see that he's actually preparing the ground. Rodrigo is very much involved with, you know, kind of eco-socialist general concerns and Anthropocene, and he's very attuned to these issues. And you can see that he decides, I mean, it's a choice he never be so explicit about, but he's not only taking the organizational point of view, but he's also taking the ecological point of view as like the grammar of the whole political field. I mean, that's also a way to facilitate, right? This book brings from ecology, like from concern with the environment, the term of ecology into the left. And the next book is going to take the concept of a socialist concept of transition and bring it into ecology, right? So he's clearly trying to find a common grammar for discussing environmental, ecological, climate change sort of problems, and problems internal to the left. And I think that's an underlying hypothesis he's making, that finding the common grammar that talks about those two things at the same time is a good step to the future. You know, like it's going to prepare us for dealing with Anthropocene and things like this. So I find that an interesting choice that he's making. I don't think he's very explicit about this in the book, but it's a conscious choice of vocabulary. It's not just expanding the vocabulary, right? He's saying that this is the best metaphor for politics in our age, which is makes sense, right? So I find that interesting. And I mean, it comes from it's very early idea of his. During the June journeys, Rodrigo was already employing this sort of concepts coming from anthropology to think like Amerindian societies and so on, like perspectivism as a kind of intrinsic problem and not just as a surface issue of communication. So he's been engaged with that kind of concerned with, you know, the relation of modernity to nature since very early on, and using those concepts to think political organizing more generally. But what I wanted to, I just have one thing I realized also in your presentation, Rafa, is that he actually spells a complete theory of what mode D is. Like he starts by saying, is the point of view of organization. Then he says, well, when you realize, when you're in the pure mode D, leadership is just a function that people pop into due to contingency. And then on top of distributed leadership, which is sort of function, is not personalized because it's not mode A or mode B or mode C, then you can create a sort of even bigger project like that, which is no longer just one leader who is a function, but a whole group of people who are also just functionally a vanguard, right? And then you can use many vanguards to limit each other and prevent the autonomization of power. So that's now a new level. And then you can use this system that started with leaderships, which move around, became organizational cores that move around. They became vanguards that can move around. And now you have platforms, which are just, let's say, typifying that dynamic and allowing for people who are outside of that to join in. So he actually tries to construct a step-by-step idea of like, because every one of these concepts have to do with, like in our formal parlance, the idea of envelopes. How do you create like synthesis of an organ, the minimal synthesis, then a slightly bigger synthesis of this synthesis, then a bigger synthesis of this smaller synthesis, to the point that you create like this heterogeneous body, right? He has a theory of organizational body, which is not mode A, mode B, or mode C. It's made up of the leadership that appears in political movements. Then that's a synthesis of correlation of force. Then when you have many of those, you start having this, you can see organizational cores, people who work closely to these leaderships or who continue to work even when leaderships change around. Then with these organizational cores, you start to see the ones that are actually the envelope, the synthesis of the process. That's the Vanguard function. Then you get to see, let's say, when you have many of those, they keep each other in check and prevent one of them from representing the movement as a whole. And then the only way to join many Vanguard functions that are moving around is to have a platform, which is a social technical thing and not a group of people, right? That allows this thing to have stability at a larger scale. So he actually, you know, tries to name every kind of step of this organizational body, which is not mode A, mode B, or mode C, right? Which is the funny thing to me, then that's my question to you. Do you think this is descriptive in the sense that this is what already happens? Like it just happens in a bad way because we don't know it's happening, right? It's just being realist in the sense that this is what's going on. That's already what happens. Movements have leaders, these leaders change. Perhaps we don't want to recognize that. That's why we resist it. We already create organizational cores because some people have more free time or connections and so on. But sometimes we don't respect this. We already have Vanguard functions because it's already how it happens. Sometimes people are more, you know, attuned, then other people are more attuned to what's going on. But sometimes we don't respect this because we create like candidates or populist charismatic leaders. So do you think this is more prescriptive? Like this is a good way to go? Or do you think this is more descriptive? Like this is what's already happening, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's both. I think because it's the same puzzle with like political realism, for example. Like, well, because you can go and say that like political realism is itself only a descriptive doctrine that tells you the reality of politics, but you cannot really say that because that wouldn't be like factual with what it is. But also you cannot say it's fully prescriptive as if like these rules came out of nowhere. It is in fact like the moment in which prescriptive and this like there's a sort of like rupture in space in which like prescriptive and descriptive become open the space for something else, for like a third thing, or like a possibility that is not really systematized already, but it's not also like but it's still legible because it talks in the categories that already exist, so in the descriptive categories that already exist. I would say that like what Rodrigo's doing is sort of like taking mode D out of the pedestal of being a regulative ideal and saying like you can start working for mode D today. In fact, like these are all types of practices in which like would be fundamental for us to building like something like a new social order. So yeah, I mean this could be, but I think it could be like for what he's doing, at least I think it has this very unwavering, yeah, but perhaps it is a sort of like a fleshing out of a regulative idea in its own way. Yeah, it's like this fleshing out through the instruments of what you already have, because in Karatani the issue is that like you have the regulative idea of mode D, but it's not really like you only have a sort of a, at least how I read it, like you only have a sort of a hint of what it is because you know what mode A is from the perspective of like where you are and like on the like from the combination that you live in. But I think that for Rodrigo he's trying to like ground this in like much more actionable steps in a way, like they're much more recognizable in action. So yeah, you could say that he's actually like doing the fleshing out of that, I think. I don't know, I think John wanted to say something, but I'm not sure if he wanted to say it or.
I'm gonna pass for it now, but
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
What the before I ask my question, what the fuck is this co-limit shit you are talking about? I mean, please translate it for people who are like Michael and me who don't understand math.
No, it's just because I mean this is scenes from the next chapters because Dennis is presenting on this book he found, which is amazing. I mean, it's the closest translation into category theory of Bogdanov we found. And the whole book is about describing how to put this, like how a certain dynamic is, how you explain kind of creation of complexity in organizations by finding a dynamic that is seen from a standpoint. So the standpoint that sees that dynamic, you call it a co-limit or a cone. You can imagine like a cone on top of a circle, right? And they use this basic idea of seeing a whole dynamic from a standpoint, like synthesizing the dynamic from a standpoint, to construct a hierarchy of complexity. So from where do you see the whole dynamic? That tells you, let's say, the next level of complexity with regards to a previous one. But then they like these two mathematicians construct a really, really cool theory on top of this with a lot of different concepts. But it's very, very close to what we're talking about. But yeah, there is already a video on this because Dennis and I did a meeting on the book, just a side meeting, and it's up on Zulip if anyone wants to like take a look.
Yeah, okay. No, okay, that cleared up a bit for me. Okay.
I love it's called a cone.
To...
Like just think of a cone, like things, and then.
Yeah, that's exactly explained to me right now. Co-limit. But yeah, unfortunately, it was dumbed down. So
like a manager is a co-limit for the functional relations of a couple of employees, you know? Like you see that.
It got a bit intelligible. I just won't keep it too long because since this will be explored later on, I'm okay. What I was going to ask, it's something that I don't know if I will be able to express it very well. I didn't get very far into the book. I was really enjoying it, but I think I read only the first 80 pages. But I thought your presentation was very good. It really helped understand some things. But one thing I was wondering, and I don't know if I'm just paying too much attention to the tools of construction, but it seems that the mixing of these various tools from different, because I don't know if this is something that is more visible from the point of view of where we are, but it seems like if Rodrigo is very concerned with doing a sort of two-dimensional structure. And doing a two-dimensional structure, it's very firm and it's very, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of things explainable. I think that's what I was thinking. But especially when you went to the later chapter where clusters comes in, and then there's also, I think it's a more mixed bag of suites. It seems like it's like if you're looking at it from a 2D point of view, it's still like pretty straight, pretty rigid. But if you try to account to the differences between different types of organizations, it seems to get a bit looser, because I think, for example, the very idea of the Vanguard Function and the fact that it seems and I mean, not the Vanguard Function, but the self-limiting of the power grabs, it's very mode A-like. And while that makes a lot of sense, it makes a lot of sense for specific things if you take it to account. I mean, there are reasons that clusters doesn't work in different situations. And what I was wondering is because I didn't like read the whole book, so I can't attest to that. If there is a bit more, if the differences in types of organization is accounted for, because in a sense it seems that especially if there's because there's this, I think this is horrible, and I think I may be more, I think I feel it more because I'm like formed in the same kind of school as he is as an ex-Deleuzian. But the metaphor is such a trap. And when you talk about environment and materialism and also bodies and ideas, I mean, it's a shit show. And I'm not saying that he does a shit show. I think he's one of the more careful readers. But in a sense, I was wondering if it's a bit too, how do I say it? Not muddy, but it seems that these things aren't fleshed out in the book, these differences. Because I think if you take into account, for example, it's something that's not fleshed out in Karatani, but I think this is something that, at least in this group, we have taken something to take as a point of further research. The difference between intercourse, in a social intercourse and in a natural intercourse. This is not a ready-made connection. I think this is the problem. These are not interchangeable types of interaction. They are very similar. There is a family pattern to them, which is why we can deal with them so easily. But it seems that there is some, there was a teacher who I loved very much. He always used to say that geniuses, they are like Nietzsche said that geniuses, great thinkers, they have long legs. They go from the top of the mountain to the top of the mountain. but we are not geniuses. We have short legs, so we have to go down the mountain by foot and then climb the mountain upwards. And I feel sometimes that when when this is when there's this attempt to mix these metaphors, sometimes you start to believe in the metaphor too much. I don't know. That's an impression, because if you think about it, I mean, okay, you have these self-controlling vanguards, and it's a whole utopia. And I think it's like it's too beautiful for me. And I think, okay, why has this never existed? But when I think about when we try and break down the types of organizations, what I find interesting at least is that you can make concrete situations more explainable through that, in a sense that, well, I mean, when you I mean, it seems that there's some unpacking to do in those sense, but still, it's something I was wondering, because yeah, maybe that's something I also have to ask him also when he comes. But
yeah, oh my God, when he comes here, he's not gonna have one single minute of peace. Like, we're gonna just be like bombing him with questions, because at that point, like, we will already have had a lot of time to digest everything. So I think he's just gonna be like exhausted afterwards, but it's gonna be great. Yeah, about this, I was thinking about like this metaphor because it connects with what Gabriel was saying also, like this metaphor of the 2D and the 3D, because that sometimes he seems like more nuanced than he actually is. I think that the best way to actually, like, when he's confronting the conceptual oppositions, I would say that he is very 2D in a way, because he's dealing with like the way that he judges that these oppositions have appeared as merely like theoretical imports within like a practical world. And the world shaped by these practices. So I think he's very 2D in these situations, but then he becomes extremely like nuanced and everything when he's analyzing both the specific like cases in which things are happening, and also the way in which, like, even when he's analyzing like texts as such, like his analysis of like debate between Wendy Brown and Jodi Nunes, for example, like it's extremely nuanced, and it sort of like tries to pick everything like from there. Although he relies on a metaphor of symmetry to do so, he attempts to because he's using Bateson, right, and symmetrical schismogenesis, but he actually manages to, like, you can see the lines of his alignment for both of them. Like, you can see what he aligns with, like, for Jodi Dean, and what he aligns with, like, for Wendy Brown very clearly, and you can see that there is an unevenness to it, even when he's treating them symmetrically, like because of the whole conceptual structure he's making. But I would say, I in that sense, I would say that, like, sure, there is a different way of nuance. The metaphors are dangerous. I think he's dealing with like extremely dangerous metaphors here, because like ecology for me is like one of the most dangerous metaphors that you can use, because it can take you literally anywhere, and like it can really take you out of whatever path we're trying to walk in. And it's really like a temptation in that sense. But I think that while there is a very strong recognition in him of like that these concepts itself, when they undergo a political context, they are already changed, and that like that change is significant. There is a significant difference between like the way that ecology is transferred to politics. So it's not really like the diagram of the social maps itself as offering automatically like the best possible categories to think about politics in a conjuncture, but that doing the exercise of thinking politics through the categories that have the most currency within a particular conjunction gives you some insight into that conjunction without action, but it also gives you work to do in the sense of like adapting and trimming down that to the most specific thing. And this is what I think he does with revolution, for example. Like he really manages to get like the history of the concept, and he trims it down into his own system. Like that revolution is the capacity of distinguishing between like the, how does he say it, about like local and
local and systemic, yeah,
local and systemic constraints, yeah. And I think that this is what he, like the book does at like the at the last throes of it, because when you it's that thing, like that's why even when I was like talking about like doing this meeting, I was recommending people to only read like 5 and 6, because the first ones are a little bit like they don't get to the meat of the thing. They just get to like it's a rehearsal of the argument. They become better when you go back to them, but they are just a rehearsal. Like the chunk of the argument is actually like on these two like conceptual chapters and the final one. The first ones are like sort of interesting background checks. There's also parts of the book that are like that. Like there is some parts that you're like, why does this guy want to argue with Negri that much? But it makes a lot of sense to argue with Negri that much if you think about like the whole political trajectory and like the way that Rodrigo's thought itself like developed out of that framework. But then for like the average reader, you're just like, okay, why are we in Italy again? Like you just get that weird feeling. But yeah, that's the main thing like that I think about like the book in terms of form. But yeah, like at least like the conceptual apparatus appear better in the second part. Was it Dennis?
I think it's Dennis, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know we're late, so I'll keep it short. I was just thinking about how, basically in response to what Victor pointed out, it's almost like you still have the problem of there's only so much sunlight, right? If you were to think of all of this ecology as kind of a garden of different things growing, that, you know, this kind of biological metaphor, or even like epigenetic landscape metaphor of different forms kind of coexisting and informing each other, there's still like these bottlenecks. And I think just wanted to point out, like, solving that in a correct way, in a way that is doesn't require one form to kind of eat up all the resources, is already, I think, like a mini version of this socialist calculation project. It's like maybe a generalized version of it. So I think it fits with the general theme of like communism means solving communist problems, not capitalist ones, right? That having this, having different organizations competing is already somehow falling into a different paradigm. Yeah, I don't know, something along those lines. I wonder if someone else could flesh that out.
Yeah, I think it goes directly with what Victor said about he's actually, I mean, I had like a couple of more philosophical comments, but I think they come up to this point as well, because the book is very much, let's say, if you were to summarize, very much is also like a plea for cooperation inside the left. Like if I were, after all discussions, if I were to summarize it in one sentence, it's just to say that there is such a thing as a conjuncture of the left. You are a realist about the conjuncture. You should be a realist about the conjuncture of the left. There are many social organizations, there are many leftist organizations. You need to start from there. Like, I think that's kind of the summary of the whole thing. That's what it means to be a realist in his sense. But then there is this issue. It's a plea for more cooperation. But the logic of cooperation versus competition is not just the ethos, right?
Yeah.
That's where, let's say, social constraints come in. Companies don't compete because they are just hungry for the market. When they compete, they share information about social totality, right? Competition is not a bad thing for companies. That's why they make it into like a prime value of capitalism, because you learn about the social totality because you compete. And it's not true that you always learn about the social system when you cooperate. That's partly the reason why competition trumps cooperation most of the time. It's not a matter of ethos. It's a matter of when you compete, sometimes under certain conditions, that's a really good way to test what form survives and what don't. So the scarcity problem, the antagonism problem, I think that this idea of ethos, sometimes, which you already pointed the moment that you read the quote, right? it seems to do a lot of work. Because you kind of like, there is a point, the point that he makes one claim about the social constraints of socialist organization. I think it's a poor point. The idea that, well, without the state, we can just remove people we don't like. Like, that's not a good, have you seen how that works? It's terrible. Like, it's when he comes into the idea of, well, ecologists remove their bad parts. Like, as Victor said, have you seen what removing the bad parts looks like in South Africa, like constructing hegemony and suffocating small movements? Like, it's, it's not that simple. So it feels underdetermined when it comes to, let's say, a more constraint-based, logical view of how these things get imposed and how they function. And I think that if you look at the three kind of philosophical underpinnings, like I think I agree with 99% of this book. I think it sounds more reformist than it is some points. Like Rodrigo clearly is not a reformist, like if you meet the guy, like that's not what he's about. So I don't think that it sounds like this because I think he really wants to push the pragmatic, nuanced, cooperative view. And this just sounds more reformist in my opinion. But nevertheless, like, though I have a lot of agreement, and I do think that he's above all politically more on the side of Bogdanov than on the side of other things. Actually, he breaks with, he's more Leninist in some crucial points. But I think that the conceptual tools he uses, which I think are three big things, is what, like, we would need to think about it to make sure we get the best out of the connection with his work. Because I think that's where some traps lie. The first is, there is a big difference between cybernetics and category theory. He supplements cybernetics, which is a very dynamic, information-based theory where everything is, related to everything else through some form of interaction. But you never really get to ask compositional questions. Like, why does this machine get to interact with that other machine? Like, how did they become commensurate to begin with? Why this noise read a signal to this sensor? Like, what are the conditions for that? That's something cybernetics tends to take for granted, right? It's much more, let's say, in our triad of composition, intelligibility, and interaction, cybernetics privileges interaction and intelligibility, which is a good kind of summary of what information is all about and so on. Doesn't really talk about composition. So I think that there's a small difference there. And like, he solves the problem of how things are composed by simply saying that they are composed in many ways. It's always a mixture. So that I think, like, the distrust of his critique of form has something to do with the fact that force is covering over the problem of specific structuring. Things are not just forces, like they are some forces and not other forces. And why these are not that reintroduces the problem of form, which is what Caron commented in the chat. Doesn't like the actual terrain where forces are shaping reality itself shaped in a certain way that facilitates this rather than that. So how do you call that, right? It has something to do with how things are composed. Then I think that there is a classical problem which we're still having a hard time overcoming, which is these two big traditions in contemporary left that I think one is more connected to 68, the other to 17. 68 is more Deleuze, Negri, Spinoza. The 17 is more Hegel, right? And the two are wrong, obviously, because after all, how could they be right? But they are wrong in different ways. The Spinozist knows that reality will always be ahead of us, and the reality always creates its own forms, that we need to respect what people think and not impose thoughts. But then you create a theory about that. So philosophy becomes, let's say, the main form of being for the autonomy of people. So philosophy itself becomes a sort of, praise of heterogeneity, praise of difference, praise of mixture, praise of nuance. But that's philosophy. That doesn't mean that actual people doing actual politics are thinking in terms of difference, of praise. They're thinking in terms of specific forms, specific. So it's a weird contradiction. Philosophy, to respect the fact that people think in different ways, it creates a discourse of difference. but then it doesn't match any real discourse. Whereas Hegelians do the inverse mistake. We know that there is some logical unfolding of one concept into another in reality, but then we say it's our development, like our concepts are usually the ones that are going to unfold in reality. So you respect the fact that people think in particular terms, but you kind of impose the particular terms from the outside. So one thinks the way that people usually think, but imposes it from the outside. The other does not think how people usually think, but is always claiming to respect that. So you get this kind of praise of difference, mixture, nuance, but like militants don't think in those terms. Like you hate the police, you hate somebody with a specific title, you think in specific categories, you don't think in nuance, right? So I think that there's this pendulum that he tends to lean on one hand. I don't think we should take any of the two sides. I think both sides are over, but I think that's one point. And then the third thing, which is the funny thing there, because Rodrigo is a Kantian, ultimately, right? And when he talks about ethos in the end, I think it's his way of saying that ultimately when you talk to organizers, you're talking about the cognitive capacity of organizers. So ultimately, you need to teach specific people how to see different, right? How to be more open, how to be more tolerant, how to be like themselves as individuals, right? So that's kind of the ultimate, which is funny because it creates that problem. Like he comes at the end and says, we need particular people, particular organizations to see the whole, but he also kind of constrains himself because the only cognitive capacity you have is the individual capacity of people. So there is a distinction there where we have the Kant version and the Badiou version, right? Either you have subjective phenomenology. Ultimately, this is a book to better instruct organizers because their heads is where decisions are going to happen. How to tolerate, navigate, take advantage of the ecology. So our individual heads are the place where we can be in both levels at the same time, right? And I think that the perspective we've been trying to develop with this objective phenomenology is the idea that the mediation that actually gets to be in both places at the same time is the organization itself, not individuals. Like you think that you are in an organization because you want to, sleep with someone else, because you want to look cool, because you're told to be. Sorry,
my bad.
No. Right, you can have like a totally personal explanation of why you're doing it, but as long as you're working in the organization and making decisions for different reasons, the organization can be already formed in such a way that it constrains you to respect the ecology. So I think that there's like the cybernetics, kind of Deleuze-Negri settling of accounts, and the Kantian thing, they form like a way of describing all these problems that are slightly different, like just a bit, emphasis on the slightly different thing.
Yeah, this after you said that, I mean, it was very clear to me that actually this last quote about the cooperation, that's basically the end of the ethics, in the sense that when we learn to trust God, we will be God, in a sense. We will be a part of God in the way that is necessary. And though the ethics is a very static book, I think it could be described as a what was that thing? Co-limit cone or something like that. The process of learning in the ethics, it really seems very, very, when you understand God in your head, you are in a sense participating in God in the only way that is possible. So these things happen at the same point. Understanding yourself and God, they are at the same point. And in a sense, when you think about it, when I said this does seem like I use the expression regulative ethogram. I don't know. Does he use the expression ethogram in the book? Because he really does like that expression.
He doesn't.
He doesn't. Oh, it's because this is an expression that he stole from Viveiros de Castro, who didn't know who he stole it from. An ethogram is basically how he uses a word he uses to describe a concept in Spinoza that the being of itself of a being. So it's like the singularity of a being. So in a sense, it seems that, well, you have like a way of being, which is the cooperative way of being, which is a way that is aware of how cooperations work and understand. And you have that as a regulative ideal, but it's not an idea because it's all as a matter of bodies interacting and organizing in a sense. So in a sense, it does look like I think what got me a bit, I wouldn't say frustrated because that's too much of a strong word. I think the hopeful side of it, which is the Spinoza side, is that, well, okay, so once we can all understand how this organizes itself, we don't have to take into account such questions, some types of questions. And I mean, I think the clusters thing is something that has been frustrating me in the recent times. The more I get back to it, I think, and especially the self-organizing of the Vanguard. I mean, it's all very pretty, but nobody wants to live in Mode A. Mode A is terrible. So this is not. I don't think that's something that really. It seems like it's too out of place. There's something missing in this self-regulating function when you actually this. How should I say it? I think I may be tripping too much. So Gabriel, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm thinking of the paper on the reformulation of anthropological theory. Yeah, I think mode B, I mean, any mode that doesn't make me interact with people is great for me. But when I was thinking the fact that if you have, if the end of your social, of the form of describing your social, like your regulative social being, if it in any sense resembles the most immediate form of socializing, there is a conservative aspect in it that should get you a bit like stop it, hold on, what is happening here? Because of course, these self-regulating functions, they do seem pretty basic. They do seem to function in a way because, especially if you take into account the division that this initial form of exchange, it only operates between the same, the other, and the, what is it? The indeterminate. So it actually, I need to read the whole book. So maybe I'm saying a lot of crap, but I do think that it's putting too much weight on something that might work for some things, for some areas, for some aspects, and it's putting it's doing a lot of overtime, the self-regulating aspect, because there is a self-regulation of the mode B, there is a self-regulation of the mode C, and in a sense, we don't do that because some of them are better. We do that because there are different aspects of social life that invite one or the other. So I don't know. I think I'm getting a clear picture of what I think that quote, and in a sense, it's a very Spinozist position, because all we want to do in Spinoza is just chill, and I mean, self-regulation is the ultimate dream for the Spinozist. No work, just chilling and contemplating God. So you build, like, it's, men will literally build a theory of political organization before picking up cleaning up the dishes or doing stuff like that. But I mean, I don't know, I'm just thinking that self-regulating, it should also be dismembered, but now I'm just rambling. So I think Caron or John,
but just to conclude the point, like, I just realized that probably a good immanent question or immanent critique, which doesn't bring anything from the outside, is that in the end, self-organization that was removed in the beginning appears as the main property of individual cognitive agents. You're supposed to, because your model in your head now includes the ecology, to better self-regulate yourself to interact with the ecology and steer it in the best possible way. So you removed it from the totality. Yeah, that's the Spinozist move, right?
Yes, that's it. I won't have to act better because from an outside, because when I know the truth, you will be another person. And actually, this is the main Spinozist point, which is you only know something when you're, and this is like how Spinoza destroys people. You only actually know something when you do it. So you can say, oh, I read the book, but I didn't change. And he will say, you didn't understand the book. If you had understood the book, you would already be acting ecologically. So this is a very fine move by Spinoza, because you take out the problem of having to build this transition. And I think this is very good, because I think it evades actually the problem of education, which is like education in a more global sense, which is, I think, is the problem that we are trying to deal when we talk about case studies and how to transmit information, because that is the problem. Not knowing is not enough. If knowing was enough, I mean, this is in Plato's Charmides. If knowing was enough, everything would be good, because someone by now would have known what is the good. And that's just not the case. Okay, sorry for the rant. So just like me dealing with my Spinozist baggage.
It's like but that was really interesting. Like the last bit on Spinoza in particular, like it's very interesting to locate like this with what Rodrigo is doing, because I really think that like it helps to sort of locate the whole thing and like within the Spinozistic tradition of things. And yeah, definitely like it has a navigational implication to it also for like reading the book. Jean?
Actually, it was about that. I really don't think this book is Lenin's What is to be Done, like basically. I don't think he's trying to do that. I don't think he's proposing practical things to do or anything like that, like reform or be more reformist or cooperate or whatever. I think those prescriptions are embedded in the framework, but they are, I mean, they are only active as embedded in the framework. For me, the cash value of the thing is the analytical framework that was a kind of sketched in the organization of the organizationless and got fleshed out in this book. Of course, there are 3 chapters about trying to introduce the whys and whens of this kind of thing. But I wouldn't say it is really like a book about how to go on about things in terms of specifics. It's a book about how to think about organization. So as long as you think of organization in this way, it is a consequence of the framework that there will be a certain kind of cooperation between the organizations. This is not the same as saying cooperate, you see? So I think the concept of the ecology of organizations is an organizational concept itself, in the sense that if you do something, there will be kind of a network consequence of that action. And this is kind of the kind of mindset that he wants to sell in this book, you see. They are kind of acting like that, but at the same time, it makes a difference for him, it seems. I think that's the wager, to see them acting like that, like to adopt this point of view instead of a different point of view. Like this is kind of, therefore, I think the book is offering a vocabulary, a certain kind of descriptive vocabulary that has kind of embedded prescriptions, but I don't think he's saying like let's do reform instead of revolution. I really don't think this is the crux of the issue. Sometimes it lends itself to this reading because of his, I'm not sure he's, for my taste, he's not as clear about the purport of this vocabulary as he could be. And sometimes, you know, there's this kind of this more personalized, individualized, almost humanistic vocabulary, like of the ethos and this kind of thing. For instance, the discussion between force and form, I agree with Gabriel. This was my point there as well. Like, I think that he sometimes gets carried away because of his polemics and what he's going against and what he's, you know, in the attempt to sell the framework. But I don't really see that the consequence, you know, that you know, the ethical consequence is mandatory in that sense. You see, I mean, you can separate the discourse about the ethical from the prescriptions that are actually embedded in the framework. And in the framework, there are some certain prescriptions, but they are not of the sort of prescriptions that say, okay, you shouldn't antagonize, you should cooperate. I don't think this is the point. The idea is, when you antagonize, there is a net result, even when you antagonize. So you have to take into account the fact that there is a final net result, even if you antagonize, even if you don't want no track with that other organization. So this is like I think what's precious about the book, actually. So I think it's more. I mean, I think it's more. More useful to separate a little bit of the, you know, rhetorical element from the framework. I do think the framework, for me, it's the fact is, you know, what's more valuable about the book. And it's not that you know, the discussion between Jodi Dean and Wendy Brown's not interesting. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the other chapters, but you know, I was kind of anxious to get to, yeah, okay, what's your analytical framework that will give us a vocabulary that will help organize in a certain sense. So you say it's kind of different to offer a vocabulary and to offer a strategy. It's a bit different. This is what I'm getting at. Offering a tactic, a specific tactic.
Yeah, no, I don't think he is. But I would just say that, you know, I think this is the book by a commie. Like, there is no, in politics, you don't construct analytics without first taking a position. Like, he's putting all his chips on the idea that composing, thinking about this more systemic point of view is an important political task. Like, yeah, this is kind of his meta strategy, but that's a political idea, true and true. It's not philosophical, it's not derived from anywhere. It's out of his experience with politics. And then the analytics comes after, but that's kind of, there is politics in the frame itself, but I agree, it's a better politics than trying to extract like a direct thing.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, this would be my take.
To me, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I like that also, because it has been something like we have spoken about this a lot at the group CPC, right? Like at the beginning, because we read chapter by chapter, so like every week we were like, okay, where is this? Where is this thing? Like because we saw the things in the introduction, we were like super hyped up, and then like, where is this? When does it come up? And then it all comes up super fast, and these two chapters in particular, like the bulk of the arguments are actually there, but the things actually start to go better, like in the argument about revolution already. Like in that chapter in particular, you can see what he's getting at. Like it looks like an introduction in a lot of ways. Like it looks like an introduction to the second part of the book, in which like things really get fleshed out. But anyway, John, you have your hand, right? What's up?
Yeah, this time for real. Thank you. That was an awesome presentation and like good kind of trendsetter on an hour. I think that's really strong. And I'm responding to your presentation because I honestly haven't had a chance to really read the book beyond a few smatterings right now. And I'll definitely kind of focus on those 2 chapters before Rodrigo's here. But just a few thoughts, largely in response to the conversation afterward, and trying to maybe kind of like get a sense of our position, differentiating it to whatever degree, or trying to understand how we relate. It seems like one way we could characterize like what it means to look at things from org as mode D. And this really clicked when Rafael Saldana said, like, you know, I don't want to live in mode A. That sounds terrible, which I agree. And it's almost like I think mode D is a kind of de-romanticized position with regard to all 3 of the modes. Like there's something about it that kind of calls for, I don't know, just critical or de-romantic or something. There was a conversation prior to all this about enlightenment. But that there's something that kind of conscientiously takes stock of the fact that none of these modes in and of themselves really solve the problem, which is something I think goes back to a core contradiction in Karatani's work, which is on the one hand, he claims at one point in world structure that like each of the 3 modes has its own distinct form of power, but then he turns around and chooses mode A as like being the least inclined to be powerful kind of power. And I think Gabriel hit the nail on the head, like the actual dynamics of like how we resolve these, and Victor's point initially when we look at large scale, the ANC, but also small scale, like when organizations don't have means to deal with problems of ethos, problems of actual behavior, problems of actual like conduct and whatnot, end up ripping each other to pieces. That's utilizing the logic of mode A. That's carrying out, I think, when it is lost perspective, when it's like kind of taken away from like a position that also takes into account the other 2 modes. And I'm just wondering like if that's one way we can kind of like position what it is we can bring to the table, because I think the vocabulary, the actual concepts that are being highlighted in Rodrigo's book are phenomenal and make a lot of sense of like a description of what's going on right now. But I think that this kind of like question of description and prescription really, like there's this weird step where people describe what the left does when it's in retraction, which is kind of fall back on mode A as its main logic, as the prescription, because that's what happens when we're getting defeated. Like there's this weird kind of like identification with the stage of retreat, I think, that has been happening. And it, I can't really respond to how, because I haven't read, but I think there's actually something remarkably similar between 1917 and 1968, which is that when both are defeated, both fall back on absolute, we're using the term 2D categories to address why things are wrong, right? Whether it's Stalinist show trials or the kind of like internal purges of like small scale organizations, like there's this kind of fallback onto an absolutist moral vocabulary the moment the actual material conditions to hold together the position of org are broken down. And that seems to be that place which like Victor highlighted in 2 really good examples, the ANC and then the Malcolm X versus MLK debate of like, what do we do about the actual violence directed at us, which is the thing that breaks down or is at least like a pretty primary thing of what breaks down the material conditions to hold org. And I wonder, Rafael, like what, especially since he considers himself a Leninist, one of the things I think Leninists do for the better and for worse is take very seriously the threat of the right or the like reaction or the state. How do you think he accomplishes that? And do you think he kind of addresses where we're at today in terms of like simultaneously like needing to protect ourselves, but also not fetishizing it to the point that we fall into these kind of like violent self-lacerations? I hope that made sense.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that there is an interesting thing, like it has to do with even like with what Victor was saying before, and also like how the handling of violence is done in mode, like through any framework that would privilege mode A and so on and so forth. But looking at the book in general, like, and how Rodrigo handles that, I think that there is, I agree like what you're saying over there. I think that there is something in Rodrigo's book though that is. Let me see how I should put it. I lost the train of my thought. Like, oh my god, wait.
Just to help with that, I think that the thing we should not forget is that he literally says social reproduction is the thing to keep in mind. And social reproduction means staying alive. So very much at the core of the idea is like, okay, you know, threats, violence, these things, they get in the way of social reproduction. Social reproduction is the thing that can bind the different lefts together. So there is a roundabout way of arguing that this is very much. Yeah, I think I think he would buy that title, social reproduction Leninism. I think that's pretty much, he would love that.
Yeah, I think that the thing with social reproduction, which makes it interesting, is also like the way that it. I think I mentioned that like in the presentation before, which is the way in which like social reproduction can bind the local with the systemic very easily in a way, because you can like you're talking about something that like people can communicate about very easily, like about their own experience, like embodiment in capitalist environment, but they can also understand that like the systemic implications of that, even when they cannot really connect. Like even when they cannot really connect the way in which their own social reproduction is implicated in the whole, they can compare between themselves very easily, because you're talking about like something that is like very almost as like very close to like needs that are like socially set in a way, like needs and desires that are socially determined. And about that, I think that this is what he wants to do. About the privileging of mode A, I also agree with you. I think that there is a very like because I think that if we take like a sort of not that generous reading, we could say that like he's doing a theory about like breaking out of like the horizontal vertical distinction by actually showing how this distinction itself like is never a decision that it's taken, but also it might seem at times that the horizontalism is the main ideal regulative, like is the main gist that regulates the whole endeavor. Like one could try to argue that, like in a critical note about the book, because of its reliance in what we are calling the mode A, for example. So that's really what I think can be dangerous about the book as such, because you could actually say that, like you could actually make that argument, and I think that it could be like a passable argument about the book, precisely in the same way that Karatani does it, because in Karatani you also miss that dimension, right? Like you only have, like you start from mode A, you end up in mode A, and then like whatever positive potentials could emerge out of mode B and mode C, they just get sort of like played down. They're never really engaged like frontally. In Rodrigo, I think one could try to do like a symmetric critique of that, but then I also think that Rodrigo deals very well with the question of like seeing what I think his reading of the conjuncture is right, in the sense that like what does he seem to think are the main points that have to be discussed in order to make like a political theory or a theory about like political organization, which are social reproduction, the Anthropocene, like all the questions are right pretty much. The framework is also like extremely useful, but then like the end reliance on an ethos is what is like a little bit weird at the end of the day. It leaves the whole thing a little bit weird, but also, as Jean said, like both of the things are not really attached, so like you can slice them up quite easily, and like, I don't think like you have to commit fully to any of them, which I think it's another positive thing for a book that wants to be passed around within like militant organizations. Yeah. Victor? Guys, can we end after this one? I really want to have dinner. I'm starving.
Can I speak?
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead. I want to hear what you want to say.
I think we could maybe combine the Rodrigo system with Gabriel and the Milso system, by introducing the concept of relationships into the ecology. So the ecology, I think there is a political presupposition. I don't know how to say this.
Presupposition, yeah.
Presupposition that is global warming is going to kill us all. So we have to unite to fight global warming in a cooperative process of the left, or we will all die. That's pretty much the presupposition of the book. And I agree with that. I think that it is a good diagnosis of the needed the alliance we need to build to survive on Earth for the next century. However, I think he should expose that the ecology that he exposes is dependent on a common agreement of that diagnosis. If we do not cooperate, we will die. Otherwise, we will have different relationships within an ecology. Every ecology has different relationships. Parasite relationships, predatory relationships, hierarchical relationships, hegemony, competition, various types of relationships. So if we introduce the concept of relationship into the ecology, we can maintain the view that is not limited to your organization and the others are bad, but we can view an ecology and try to articulate the relationships between the organizations that keep it, if we want to maintain the presupposed notion of Rodrigo, from working together for common survival. Because there are various reasons why we don't unite. They are legitimate reasons. They are not reasons that people have that are not based on a reality, on a political practice, on an experience that they actually have. So we have to deal with that, I think. So maybe that would be a solution. But I agree with John that, in fact, the contribution of the book in giving a tools that we didn't have. I don't think anyone has said that the left thinks of itself in a hegemonist sense always. Autonomists always think of staying in the vanguard forever. Leninists too, anarchists too, everyone thinks they have to be the vanguard. If they are not, the leadership is being wrong and corrupted, and he can deal with that without making people give up their ideological viewpoint. You don't have to stop being an anarchist. You just have to understand the Leninists will do their thing. The church will do their thing. PT will do their thing. We will do our thing. It is natural. There is no one's bad. There's no bad intention exactly here. That is very valuable, I think, and it makes possible conversations that weren't possible before we had this tool to analyze the conjuncture. That's it.
Yeah, no, the first thing that you said about the Anthropocene, I just think that like this is interesting because it has become a sort of backdrop in terms of like I've seen that a lot when I was reading stuff for like my master's thesis, because it has become a sort of like lurking backdrop of these things. So like you look at the Anthropocene as like something that calls for something else. So the Anthropocene is this like planetary circumstance. It calls for a sort of connectivity, which can easily be translated into like human terms as cooperation, or like even conversely in like non-human terms as like cooperation, symbiosis, or whatever. Like you can have any types of metaphors for like coexistence instead of merely like trying to sort of take away of like a diagram in which you would only have like a one-way arrow to actually like put a two-way thing, or to like sort of think about relationship itself as a category that is important for the Anthropocene, and so on and so forth. But I think that Rodrigo's book has a little bit of that. It might appear like on the, but the biggest merit that it does, and which is something that I think that someone still has to expand on, because I don't think it finishes doing this task, because it's a very big task, which is like, how do we connect the Anthropocene with social reproduction as such, which is oh yeah, I think there is this lurking over there, but there is also like and the counterpart to that is the like, this is sort of the in fact this is sort of the basis of how he connects social reproduction with the Anthropocene as such, because this was also the question that I had in my own like in my master's thesis, because like how do you connect two things that like are sensed so differently? Like one of them is sensed in an extreme immediacy, like to the point of being like almost a need, and one of them is literally invisible from human scale, like you can only perceive it through like technically mediated scales and climate science and things that are extremely abstract. And like, how do you mediate between both of those things? For Rodrigo, it seems that you mediate between both of those things through organization. And I think that this is like this is a fascinating nexus that like, because for me, in like how I try to mediate between that was sort of like making production always ecological in a way. So like spelling out what is ecological about like the work, life and production, and like production and consumption. What is like, how is this always implied ecologically? But Rodrigo's move is much smarter, because he introduces like he introduces politics back into the picture. It becomes something like less and less related to like an image or a diagram or whatever, and becomes like more related to these actual struggles. And yeah, I think he really manages to find a way of something that in my like in how I thought was just a call to action of like, yeah guys, like please understand that these issues are connected. Like no, it was giving like the tools for these issues to be connected in the first place and to be visibly connected. And but it always poses this challenge that like perhaps the main backdrop through which you can make these claims is the backdrop that like the world is ending, and perhaps what happens is that when the world is ending, cooperation is assumed as something that it is really not, and when in fact like other types of dynamics would be more beneficial to it. And I also think that like any time that the world is ending and like you cannot really make like a point, like your point goes too much back to mode A, and you cannot really make a point about plunder and redistribution, which is the second part of mode B. Things start feeling a little bit strange, because like I strongly think that like what can save us from whatever's coming at us is just climate tyranny in a lot of ways. Like it's gonna be climate tyranny or that or death. I mean, death is inevitable, but like a very much more sudden death, definitely.
That's how Rafael wants to end this presentation. You know, climate tyranny is coming around the corner. Sorry, Rodrigo.
But there are good ways. Like tyranny is always redistributive. Like that's just the question is like, where does it redistribute to and from? Like
the tyranny of the proletariat or the tyranny of the bourgeoisie? Yeah, the climate theory of the proletariat. That's your proposal. I like that. I can vibe with that, perhaps.
Yeah.
Man, it was such a good presentation, man. Thank you so much. It was a great discussion.
Thank you. It was great. Yeah, I'm very glad I took I was delaying this for so much. I'm very glad I took the time to actually do it. So
no, it was amazing. It was really amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, guys.
Bye.
See you all.
Cheers.
Bye, Vitor. Bye,
See
Carmen.
y'all.
Bye, everyone.
All right.